Robb Stark stood atop a low rise at the edge of the city, the wind tugging at the dark curls of his hair, carrying the smells of blood and smoke and the unsteady promise of something new. Dawn approached in a wash of ashen pink along the eastern sky. Below him sprawled King's Landing, its high walls black against the pale morning light. The city was already stirring, though it was not the usual bustle of merchants or peasants going about their days. The siege had lasted weeks, and fear clung to the narrow streets. From this vantage, he could see the tall spires of the great September of Baelor rising like an accusation against the horizon. At this hour, the bells were not tolling, and the hush seemed portentous. They had waited in the cool darkness all night, the lords and knights of the north and the riverlands, each man thinking of what victory might mean, or what his life would be worth should they fail. Robb had encircled the city from multiple sides, at last forging alliances he had once deemed impossible. Throughout the preceding weeks, he had received word of cracks forming among the Lannisters' supporters. Rattled by defeats on every side, the Lannisters retreated behind the high walls of King's Landing, hoping that the Red Keep and all its secrets would protect them. But no fortress was impenetrable. Catelyn Stark stood nearby, clad in a simple riding cloak of deep gray, shoulders heavy with care. Her eyes, rimmed with red from sleepless nights, rested on her son's profile. He had his father's features, an echo of Ned Stark that made her heart twist. When he turned, she saw a determination there that was new, a sharper edge to the compassion that had once guided his every step. She remembered how reluctant he was to march on the city at first, how he had questioned if his rightful place was on a throne or in the north. But that boyish uncertainty had vanished in the fires of war. The young wolf was ready now. There was no question of waiting longer. Each day gave the Lannisters time to prepare, and even if House Tyrell had turned neutral when Robb and his allies had successfully negotiated for the Riverland's safety, there were still plenty of foes inside the city. The Gold Cloaks were uncertain in their loyalty, but the King's Landing Watch was still a formidable force behind the closed gates. Tyrion Lannister, so the rumors said, had tried to negotiate to save the city from ruin, but there were too many pieces on this board. Joffrey Baratheon and, behind him, Cersei, had refused to consider any terms that humiliated them. In the hush of that dawn, Robb cleared his throat. "We make our final advance when the sun is over the city," he said. His voice no longer wavered. Those nearest him caught a breath. "Ser Edmure," he continued, turning to his uncle, "I trust the Tully men are in position. We cannot allow any break in our lines." Edmure Tully bowed his head. The siege had changed him too, shaping him into something more thoughtful and less eager for vanity. "They're positioned in the north of the city, my lord. When the signal comes, we'll press at the gates." Robb turned then to Lord Bolton. Roose Bolton wore a face so pale it looked bloodless, but his voice was perfectly calm. "My men stand ready on the eastern side, near the muddy patch beyond the fish market. They'll press any defenders, keep them busy, make them think the main thrust is from there." Robb nodded. "Good." He swallowed, mouth dry. "We'll bring the ram from the west. It's less fortified, especially after last month's sabotage. If all goes well, we'll breach the outer gate quickly and then the city is ours." Catelyn touched her son's shoulder gently. "Remember mercy if you can, Robb." She squeezed his arm, searching his eyes. "For the small folk, King's Landing is full of innocent people who never asked for this war." He inclined his head, acknowledging her words. "We'll do what we must, but I will not become a tyrant, mother. The small folk are not my enemies. Our quarrel lies with the Lannisters. Once we have the city, I'll ensure the people come to no harm, so long as they don't stand in the way." Catelyn breathed more easily at that, for she feared what a prolonged battle might mean, especially once men with grudges flooded through the gates. But she knew she could not shield him from what came next. There would be blood, and that was the way of wars. The first blast of the horn split the silence when the sky was only just beginning to lighten. Robb raised his hand. Catapults fired from hidden positions, flinging stone and flaming pitch. The defenders on the walls could be heard shouting, an urgent clamor carried by the wind. There was no turning back. Robb mounted his horse, gray wind padding at the flank. The dire wolf was a fearsome sight, larger than any normal beast, muzzle gray, eyes glowing with intelligence. At Robb's signal, the northern cavalry and outriders sped across the uneven ground toward the city gates. Battering rams, wagons, and siege towers rumbled forth. War cries from the men behind him seemed to merge into a single roar. The ride felt both excruciatingly slow and as swift as a heartbeat. Robb's stomach turned and twisted. The bulk of the city walls, pocked with old scars and new repairs, loomed. He had faced many battles, Whispering Wood, the victory at Oxcross, the stalemate near Harrenhal, but never something so final. To fail here would mean the slaughter of his army, his family's hopes dashed. But to succeed would give him the greatest seat of power in the Seven Kingdoms and a chance to carve a new future. He glimpsed small folk scurrying behind the battlements as they tried to hide. Some of them threw stones or rubbish down at the intruders below. Others clung to the rumor that the Northmen would be more just masters than the Lannisters had been. Perhaps. He could not guess how many potential enemies lurked within. As the cavalry hammered across the churned ground, Edmure Tully's forces pressed from the north, and Roose Bolton's from the east. Shouts echoed from every side, and then the first wave of arrows came. So many black-fletched shafts soared overhead that the sky seemed to darken. Robb ducked low in the saddle. On his right, a northern rider took an arrow in the throat, flipping from his horse with a wet cry. Another arrow thudded into the flank of Robb's mount. The horse screamed, reared, nearly unseating him, but with a skill honed over these long campaigns, he kept his seat and spurred the horse on. Gray wind bounded ahead, snarling, ignoring the bristling darts. The moment they reached the outer gate, the siege engineers rolled forth the ram. Men heaved. The ram, covered with wet hides to deter flame, looked monstrous. An iron battering head shaped like a snarling wolf. It swung and crashed into the thick timbers. Once, twice, 3 times. From above, defenders poured boiling oil. The smell of burning hides and flesh joined the swirl of blood and ash. But the Tully archers were quick to retaliate, launching flaming arrows that forced the city's defenders to duck behind their crenellations. Amid the chaos, Robb glimpsed the banner of the dire wolf flapping high, silhouetted against rising smoke. He urged the men on. The gate began to buckle. In that moment, something soared overhead. A pot of wildfire, perhaps. His heart seized, remembering stories of that green, hellish flame. But it never detonated. The pot smashed on the ground, spattering the leftover contents harmlessly. Tyrion Lannister's rumored stockpiles of wildfire must have been used or protected differently. If the defenders had any, they were not using it effectively. Perhaps they feared setting half the city ablaze. Harder, Robb roared. Break it down. With a tremendous groan, the gates cracked. Timber splintered. A wave of armed northerners charged through. Swords clashed. Men screamed. Blood slicked the stones. Robb's heart hammered as he guided his horse through the smashed remains, gray wind lunging beside him. The city streets lay ahead, winding and narrow, lined with terrified onlookers. Some of the city watch in their gold cloaks tried to form ranks, but a fierce onslaught of black and gray-clad warriors crashed into them. The fight spattered red across the cobblestones. Edmure Tully and his men soon broke another gate, surging in from the north. The flanking maneuver by Roose Bolton's forces in the east pinned many of the gold cloaks between 2 fires. Even so, the battle for King's Landing was far from over. Robb pressed onward, leading his men deeper into the city. The smell of rot, sewage, and fear assaulted him. Cries rang out from windows overhead. The small folk shrank in doorways or took up arms with makeshift weapons. Some cheered, having grown to hate the Lannisters. But a good number simply looked on with dread, wanting only to survive. "Form up," Robb yelled, voice echoing off stone walls. "Stay together." The last thing he wanted was for his men to splinter and loot. This city was the seat of power in the realm, and if he was to claim it, he needed more than just a victory. He needed the people's goodwill, or at least their acceptance. From the high vantage of the Red Keep, horns blew again. The second ring of defense, soldiers wearing the crimson and gold insignia of the Lannisters, began pouring out of side streets to meet the Northerners. Trumpets, the clash of steel, the shrill screams of horses. Robb's hand trembled on his reins. He forced his mind to quiet. Was Joffrey somewhere behind those walls, wearing his crown and trembling? Was Cersei huddled with the Kingsguard? He knew Tyrion Lannister had always been the clever one, rumored to be inside the castle, perhaps trying to keep the city from burning. In the swirl of chaos, a group of Lannister knights spotted the direwolf banner and charged. Robb raised his sword. The ring of steel on steel jolted up his arm as the first knight's lance struck, glancing off his breastplate. Gray wind leapt at the man's horse, snapping at its neck. Another knight pressed in from the left, and Robb narrowly deflected a blow that would have split his helm. The clang rattled his skull. He kicked his horse around and brought his sword down in a savage arc. The blow bit through the man's visor, sending him crashing. It was brutal, but the man would have killed him if he'd hesitated. Somewhere behind, Robb heard a trumpet blast. Riverlords forging deeper into Flea Bottom, if his battle plan was being followed. Men who had endured the Lannisters' oppression in the Riverlands were determined to see their enemies crushed. Robb just prayed they would remember his commands and keep their vengeance from spilling onto the innocent. A swirl of shapes to his left, Bolton riders. They cut through the gold cloaks like a hot knife through butter. Roose Bolton himself approached, face impassive, spattered with blood. He inclined his head to Robb in a cold acknowledgement before turning his mount and vanishing down a crooked alley, leading his men to take control of the eastern approach to the Red Keep. Robb pressed on, each step of his horse a hazard on blood-slick streets. The King's Gate, the Mud Gate, the Lion Gate, he'd studied them all. The city was a labyrinth, but he had studied maps by candlelight in Riverrun and again at Harrenhal. They would converge on the Red Keep from multiple approaches, ensuring that the royal family and the last defenders could not slip away by the royal docks or any hidden postern gates. "Protect the small folk," he shouted when he saw a group of his men wrestling with a cowering merchant. "We came for the Lannisters, not these people." Some obeyed, others were too lost in the frenzy of violence. Yet Robb's presence reigned in the worst of it. He could not be everywhere at once, but as the morning light brightened, the prospect of victory shimmered in every step. A party of gold cloaks appeared ahead, blocking a major thoroughfare. Their captain was large, with a bushy black beard. He called for the Northmen to halt, brandishing a spear. Robb saw fear in the man's eyes, though he tried to hide it behind bravado. "Surrender," Robb demanded. "Lay down arms, and no harm will come to you. King's Landing will not be sacked if you cease fighting." The captain spat on the ground. "We serve King Joffrey." Behind Robb, a dozen northern spearmen fanned out. He did not relish killing men who were only following orders, but war was war. The gold cloak captain hurled his spear. Robb jerked his shield up, deflecting the throw. One of Robb's men answered with a swift arrow that took the captain in the throat. A wet gurgle and he fell. The rest of the gold cloaks broke and ran. Some flung their weapons down, while others fled into the warren of side streets. "Advance!" Robb bellowed, spurring on. He felt sweat soaking his padding beneath the armor, chest tight from exertion and tension. Gray wind loped at his side, muzzle stained with gore. The direwolf's savage presence made short work of any who attempted to close in. The men following Robb parted for the beast as though for a living god of war. They pressed deeper into the city. The Red Keep rose up ahead, perched on Aegon's high hill. Thin lines of smoke curled from sections of the sprawling fortress. Robb recalled the stories of dragons once roosting here, the seat from which Aegon the Conqueror had ruled. Now, in a twist of fate, a Stark might seize it from the Lannisters. Not for the first time, his mind roamed to the faces he had left behind. Sansa was rumored to still be in King's Landing, possibly held hostage in the Red Keep. Arya was missing, her fate unknown since the tragedy at King's Landing months prior. And there was his father, Ned Stark, executed by Joffrey on the steps of Baelor's September. The memory fueled a deep anger that steadied Robb's sword hand. He would not leave the city until justice was done. More pockets of resistance flared. A squad of Lannister guards, wearing the lion sigil, had taken a position behind overturned wagons. They fired crossbows at the approaching Northerners. 2 men near Robb fell, bolts punching through mail. Gray wind charged, flitting between the wagons, and soon shrieks told of the guards' demise. Robb surged forward with the rest of his men, scattering the defenders. At last, they reached the foot of the Red Keep's walls. Catapults and scaling ladders had been dragged through the city's winding streets by the vanguard. Already, men were scrambling up the ladders. Archers traded arrows with defenders on the ramparts. The keep was massive, ringed by walls that had stood for centuries, now manned by the best Lannister soldiers and the Kingsguard if any of them still remained. Robb dismounted, for there was little use in fighting on horseback here. Gray wind remained near, hackles raised. You, and you," he barked, pointing to the men carrying grappling hooks. "Secure those lines." He turned to the Tully knights who had arrived, panting and dust-choked. "Help them get those ladders in place. Once we're inside, spread out and secure the main courtyard. No one kills any hostage. On my word." In the swirl of battle, he glimpsed Catelyn standing behind a phalanx of loyal warriors, her face etched with worry. He motioned for her to remain back, but she only pressed a hand to her heart, giving him strength with her silent presence. Sparks flew overhead, and the clang of steel on steel rose anew. Lannister archers on the ramparts took aim at the assaulting men, but the tide was too strong. The advantage was with the attackers now that the city outside the keep had largely fallen. Through every gate and courtyard, Northern men poured in. The first scaling ladder thumped against the wall. Northern soldiers scrambled up, raising shields to deflect arrows or stones. Some fell, their screams drowned in the clamor. Others reached the top, hooking shields over the parapet and dragging themselves onto the ramparts. Battle raged along the battlements, a savage struggle that ended in men tumbling into the yard below. The portcullis leading into the main yard rattled. Bolton's men battered at it. Robb raised his voice above the din. "Push forward!" A pair of heavy-limbed Northmen hauled a battering ram into place. The ring of defenders on top of the walls tried to set the ram on fire or break it with stones, but they could only slow it. Robb found himself at the base of a ladder, eyes lifted to the swirling melee above. "Go!" shouted one of his bannermen. Robb took hold of the rungs, ignoring the protests of those who wanted to shield him from the thick of the fight. He climbed, heart-pounding. Halfway up, someone from above tried to shove the ladder away from the wall. Robb felt the wooden frame lurch. He pressed himself flat as the man behind him on the ladder lost his balance, falling with a scream. Gray Wind's savage snarl echoed from somewhere behind, as if the direwolf sought to protect his master from below. Robb pressed on, rung after rung. At the top, he saw 2 Lannister men hooking pikes under the ladder to push it off. But the ladder was anchored below with thick ropes. With a raw grunt, Robb heaved himself over the crenellation and onto the walkway. Immediately, a spear jabbed toward him. He twisted, feeling the blade scrape across his armor. He lashed out with his sword, cutting down the spearman in a swift, brutal motion. Blood sprayed the stones. Another man lunged. Robb parried, stepping inside the blow and delivering a sharp elbow to the man's jaw. The Lannister guard stumbled. Robb's sword flashed again, and that soldier was gone. His mind was a red haze, instincts honed on too many battlefields. He pressed forward, clearing space for the next wave of Northerners who clambered up behind him. In minutes that felt like hours, they gained control of that section of rampart. Robb surveyed the yard inside. The once pristine courtyard was littered with debris and the bodies of men who had tried to hold it. A group of Bolton men had forced the portcullis open, their pale pink flayed-man banners visible in the crush. They poured into the courtyard, swords slick with blood. Standing there, at the far side of the yard, was a cluster of knights wearing the regal lion crest, forming a last stand. Between them, Smaller in stature but wearing exquisite armor, stood Tyrion Lannister. The imp, his mismatched eyes reflected defiance and caution. Robb gestured to his men. "Secure the gatehouse and open the main gate," he ordered. He then leapt down from the wall onto a slanted rooftop, carefully dropping the rest of the way into the courtyard. Grey Wind padded up, sniffing around. The direwolf bared teeth at any Lannister man who dared to approach. Tyrion, blood staining his fine cloak, watched Robb's approach. "So," he said, voice carrying more wry exhaustion than fear. "The young wolf arrives at last." His gaze flicked to Grey Wind. "And the wolf." Robb kept his sword ready. Around them, small skirmishes ended as more Lannister soldiers threw down their arms or were cut down. "Surrender the keep," he said. "Order your men to lay down arms. I have no wish to kill more than I have to." Tyrion exhaled as if weary. "I've tried to be the voice of reason more times than I can count. I suspect that ends today." He glanced over his shoulder at the knights around him, then back at Robb. "I cannot speak for all, but you might find many would rather surrender than die for Joffrey." Robb inched closer. "If you yield, your life will be spared. You'll be taken into custody, but you will not be harmed." "It's not my life I fear for," Tyrion said, voice hoarse. He eyed the burning skies of King's Landing, hearing the distant chaos and heartbreak. "'Kay. But so be it. For what it's worth, I warned them. I told them the city would fall if they kept to madness. My sister never listens." With that, he let his sword drop from his hand, the clang echoing across the courtyard. Several knights with him hesitated. One spat, another sank to his knees. Eventually, they realized it was over. They threw down arms. Roose Bolton appeared near Robb, silent as a wraith. "We have men inside the keep's corridors. Pockets of resistance remain, but they're scattered. We'll flush them out soon enough." Robb nodded but kept his eyes on Tyrion. "Where is Joffrey Baratheon? Where is my sister, Sansa Stark?" Tyrion wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a smear of blood. "I'd wager Joffrey is in the throne room or cowering in Maegor's holdfast. My sister with him, no doubt. As for Sansa, she's likely in her chambers, still a hostage. But no one tells me anything these days." Robb gestured for two of his guards to seize Tyrion. "Hold him, but gently. I'll question him more when this is done." Tyrion raised a sardonic eyebrow. "At least you didn't lop my head off. That's progress." Without another word, Robb pivoted, scanning the courtyard. Already, the main gate was being thrown open from within, and the battered northern army was pouring in. The courtyard filled with direwolf banners, Tully Trout, and Bolton's flayed man standard. The Red Keep was nearly theirs. A shriek from above made Robb look up. From a high balcony, a blonde figure peered down. Even at a distance, Robb recognized his sister's hair color. Sansa wore a pale dress, her hands gripping the rail. Fear contorted her face. When she saw the direwolf banners, he heard a cry so filled with relief and shock that it cut him to the core. "Sansa!" he shouted back, though he doubted she could hear him through the uproar. "Stay there. I'll come for you." He turned to the men around him. "Bolton, with me. We head to the throne room. Edmure, secure the holdfast. Search for Sansa Stark." Edmure Tully nodded, summoning a contingent of Tully men to scour the keep. Roose Bolton's pale eyes flicked upward, then to Robb. "The throne room is near the main entrance of the keep. We can reach it from here easily." They moved quickly, stepping over rubble and bodies. The corridors leading into the great hall were eerily silent. Torchlight flickered on polished tiles. Heavy doors lay smashed open or half ajar. The hush was broken by the occasional clash of swords from distant rooms. Through the broken windows, Robb glimpsed plumes of dark smoke rising from the city. He prayed that the chaos would not last. In the broad hallway leading to the throne room, they encountered a line of men wearing the Kingsguard's white cloaks. Fewer than before, perhaps half the original number. The legendary hound, Sandor Clegane, was not among them. Rumors said he fled after the Battle of the Blackwater or had deserted the moment the tide turned. The knights present looked grim. Meryn Trant, Boros Blunt, and Osmond Kettleblack. Meryn Trant had a sneer twisting his thin lips. "You'll not get past this threshold alive." Robb felt a wave of fury at the sight of the man who'd served Joffrey through so many cruelties. He raised his sword. "Stand aside. Your king is lost. You need not throw your lives away." Trant spat, brandishing a long sword. "I serve House Baratheon, by which I mean King Joffrey. If you want him, you'll have to kill me." Robb's men fanned out, taking positions. Grey Wind snarled at Robb's side. In the flickering torchlight, Bolton's expression was impossible to read, but his voice was calm. "Then you have chosen." The clash was swift and brutal. Trant lunged at Robb, a series of powerful practice swings. Robb met him blow for blow, teeth clenched. He recalled hearing how Meryn Trant had struck Sansa once. That memory only sharpened his focus. Steel shrieked against steel. Trant was good, but Robb was stronger than he had been at the war's beginning, and his hatred lent an edge to his resolve. He parried high, stepped in, and battered Trant's guard aside. A savage downward slice opened the Kingsguard's shoulder. Trant stumbled with a cry, and Robb drove the point of his sword through the man's breastplate. Trant's eyes went wide, then went dark. Grey Wind, meanwhile, had hurled itself at Boros Blunt, pulling him to the ground before he could land a blow. The man screamed as the direwolf tore out his throat. The last of the knights, Osmond Kettleblack, tried to flee. Bolton's men tackled him, disarming him. Robb took a breath, chest heaving, blood slick on his sword. He could hardly remember the final blow. He turned to see Bolton regarding him impassively. "Shall we proceed?" Bolton asked. They shoved open the doors to the throne room, which had already been damaged. One door hung askew on its hinges, the other splintered. Inside, the cavernous hall was dim, lit by only a few remaining torches in sconces along the walls. The towering iron throne loomed at the far end, a twisted mass of swords hammered together in that iconic shape. On the steps before it stood Joffrey Baratheon in his gilded finery, crown askew on his golden head. Beside him stood Cersei, her green eyes sparking with desperation. The Kingsguard knights who could still stand had formed a protective cluster, though they looked rattled. Scattered around the floor were bodies of men who had clearly tried to defend the throne room. A handful of them wore gold cloaks, others wore Lannister red. The stench of fear was thick. Joffrey looked pale, his lips parted in a snarl. Cersei clutched at his arm as if trying to steady him. Robb advanced with measured steps, Grey Wind at his side, Bolton just behind. More northern soldiers filtered in, forming a semicircle around the remnants of the Lannister guard. Joffrey let out a ragged bark. "You'll die for this traitor. You murdered my grandfather. You dare to—" Robb's voice came out quiet but cutting. "Your grandfather died in battle, and I'd not speak of betrayal if I were you. You ordered my father's execution." Cersei's eyes flicked around the hall, searching for some escape or advantage. "We'll pay any ransom. Name your price," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "You've sacked the city. You have what you wanted. Let us go, and I'll see you richly rewarded." "Your gold means nothing to me," Robb replied. He took another step, ignoring the swords bristling before the dais. "You destroyed my family, butchered those loyal to us. The North will never forget." Joffrey fumbled with the sword at his waist, trying to draw it. "I am the king," he spat, voice cracking. "You bend the knee to me, Stark, or I'll have your head like I had your father's." He wrenched the sword free, waving it wildly. Grey Wind snarled, taking one low step forward, the muscles under his fur rippling. Several Lannister men took a step back. Joffrey paled. Bolton's voice was low, almost mocking. "Best mind the beast, your grace." In that moment, the last of Joffrey's defenders lunged. A clash ensued on the floor of the throne room. Robb locked eyes with Cersei, who took a few hurried steps backward, pressing Joffrey behind her. Her face was a mask of panic. The flurry of steel ended almost as quickly as it began, outnumbered Lannister men dropping their weapons. Robb strode forward. Joffrey shrank back until his shoulders hit the base of the Iron Throne. You'll regret this," he said, voice pitched high in terror. My mother has a plan, But Cersei was out of words. She looked at Robb with hatred so raw it seemed to burn the air around her. "If you have any honor, you will let your sister go." Robb's sword hovered at Joffrey's chest. He saw the flicker of fear in those green eyes that had once shown so much cruelty. He was only a boy, a vile, monstrous boy who had never known true accountability. Robb's anger raged hot, his mind conjuring Ned's final moments. He thought of Sansa, humiliated and beaten in this very court. He thought of Arya, lost. He nearly drove the blade forward, but his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Remember mercy if you can." He turned his head slightly, noticing the hall was filling with more of his men, along with several of the city watch who had cast aside their Lannister loyalties. The watchers held their breath, uncertain of Joffrey's fate. Then, with deliberate care, Robb lowered the sword. "You are no king," he said quietly. "I claim this city, and I name you my prisoner. Stand down, or I will end you here." Joffrey's hand trembled on his sword. Cersei placed a hand on his arm, urging him to lower the blade. It slipped from his grasp, clanging on the stone floor. The boy's eyes filled with tears of frustration and terror. Seeing that, Robb stepped back. Bolton's men rushed in, seizing Joffrey and Cersei, binding their wrists. Cersei hissed a string of curses, calling them traitors and barbarians. But there was nothing she could do. Robb sheathed his sword, turning to survey the hall. Victory was his, though it felt more hollow than he had imagined. The city was in chaos. The rest of the keep had to be fully secured. He still needed to find Sansa, confirm her safety, then restore order to the capital. But for a moment he allowed himself to breathe. The crown had tumbled from Joffrey's head, rolling on the dais with a metallic clink. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and grim necessity. The Red Keep was searched from tower to dungeon. Smaller fights broke out in corners of the city where loyalist pockets refused to yield. But gradually word spread. Joffrey Baratheon was captured, the Lannisters dethroned, and Robb Stark was in command. The City Watch began switching their allegiance in droves, handing over officers who had tortured or extorted them under Lannister rule. Tyrion Lannister was confined to a tower under guard, outwardly resigned to his fate, though his mind was surely plotting ways to survive or even negotiate. Within hours of the throne room confrontation, Edmure Tully managed to find Sansa Stark in her old chambers, locked under guard. She threw herself into her uncle's arms, sobbing, asking if Robb was truly alive and in the city. The news that Joffrey was captured left her stunned and trembling with relief. Within the day, she was brought to Robb, who held her as she wept for the father they had lost, the horrors she had suffered. The city was filled with the clamor of triumph, fear, and uncertain hope. Robb declared martial law for the time being, using northern soldiers to patrol the streets, quell looting, and set up distribution of bread and fresh water to the small folk as best they could. The last thing he wanted was a starving, rioting populace that saw him as just another tyrant. Catelyn Stark took it upon herself to organize some measure of relief for the wounded, establishing a makeshift hospital in a courtyard near the Great September, with help from the Septas who dared to remain in the city. In the Great Hall, still reeking of smoke, Robb held a tense meeting with the lords who had followed him to victory. Roose Bolton stood at his left, Edmure Tully to his right. Great John Umber was there too, his booming laugh subdued by the gravity of their new situation. Lesser lords from the Riverlands and the north crowded in, each seeking a say in what came next. "We have King's Landing," Robb began, voice echoing off the tall pillars. "But our work is not done. The realm is fractured. Winter is coming, and we need order." He didn't care to sit on the Iron Throne just yet, preferring to stand on the steps leading up to it. The twisted swords of the seat loomed behind him, an uneasy reminder of the power that had cost so much blood. Roose Bolton's soft voice cut the air. "We should proclaim you King of Westeros, your grace. Solidify our power." A swift declaration to all corners of the realm would serve. Edmure Tully nodded, though less eagerly. "We have the city, we hold Joffrey prisoner. Though Stannis Baratheon, last I heard, remains at Dragonstone, licking his wounds. He may contest your claim. And what of Renly's widow, Marjorie Tyrell, and the Tyrell host? Word is they've mostly withdrawn to Highgarden, uncertain whom to back now." A murmur spread among the lords. Some argued that Stannis had the better claim by law. Others insisted the northern cause, with the Lannisters overthrown, must now unify the realm under Robb's banner. The Great John bellowed that the Iron Throne was theirs by right of conquest, never mind any so-called law. Robb listened carefully, letting the swirl of voices fill the hall. Finally, he raised a hand for quiet. "We must be practical. If we proclaim me King of the Seven Kingdoms, we will face war on every side unless we can secure alliances. And there is Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, rumored to have dragons. Who knows what that may bring? But we cannot linger, or everything we have fought for will crumble. We need the city stable, the small folk fed, and the lords either allied or neutral." Roose Bolton's pale eyes glittered. "Then marry someone of influence, forge new ties." Robb frowned. He remembered his promise to Talisa or Jane Westerling in another telling, but she was gone or possibly lost. The war had separated them in one version of events. Guilt and sorrow pricked him, but he set it aside. "An alliance might be necessary," he said softly, "but let us focus on immediate concerns. Edmure, see that the water supply is secure. Great John, your men will handle any remnants of resistance. Lord Bolton, keep watch for any sign of Tyrell or Baratheon incursion." They began to disperse, each with tasks to perform. The weight on Robb's shoulders felt heavier than ever. Seizing King's Landing was only the start. Could the North remain separate? Or must he claim the entire realm to ensure safety for his people? He stared at the Iron Throne, a monstrous seat, hammered from 1,000 swords of Aegon's enemies. Was he truly meant to sit there? The thought made him uneasy. Word spread across the realm swiftly. Ravens flew from the rookery in the Red Keep, carrying messages that the Northmen held King's Landing, that Joffrey Baratheon was their prisoner, and that any lord who wished to avoid further bloodshed should come to treat with Robb Stark. The responses would take time. Meanwhile, the city's tension vibrated. The gold cloaks who had not fled or been killed bent the knee to Robb. Many small folk cautiously emerged to test the new regime. They found northern soldiers patrolling, some with foreign ways, but not as brutal as Lannister men had been when punishing them. Still, there were incidents. Looters and criminals saw the chaos as a chance to take what they wanted. Several houses in Flea Bottom burned. Some men of the North took advantage, ignoring Robb's commands for discipline. A few unscrupulous mercenaries, who had deserted from the Lannisters or even arrived in secret, sowed confusion. Little by little, Robb's captains clamped down, employing swift and severe justice on anyone harming innocents. The small folk, seeing that the new order punished its own as well as their foes, began to trust. Some even prayed the Starks might be gentler masters than the Lannisters or the Targaryens before them. Amid this fragile peace, Joffrey and Cersei remained under guard. Joffrey shrieked and threatened any jailer who came near, while Cersei tried every cunning word she possessed to sway her captors. She insisted that her father, Tywin, had reinforcements on the way, ignoring reports that Tywin Lannister had been killed in a previous battle. She seemed to think that if she kept proclaiming Lannister power, it would appear like magic to rescue her. It did not. Tyrion Lannister, on the other hand, was kept in better quarters. Robb, remembering Tyrion's attempts to help Sansa and the city in the past, saw that he was given some measure of comfort. He wanted Tyrion's counsel, Lannister or not. The man was astute, but it was a delicate matter. On the second night after the fall of King's Landing, Robb walked the ramparts of the Red Keep. The moon hung low, bathing the rooftops in silver. He rested a hand on the stone merlin, thinking of all that had transpired. The city was still restless beneath him, a patchwork of lights and shadows. He wondered if he had chosen the right path. Would Ned Stark have done the same, or would he have sought some different resolution? War had forced Robb's hand, shaped him into something he never thought he'd be. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see his mother. Catelyn's face was lined with worry, but her eyes held pride. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. She joined him at the wall, gazing at the city. "You've done what many thought impossible. You've taken King's Landing. You've avenged your father." Robb's chest tightened. "I don't know if vengeance is the right word. Father never wanted all this bloodshed. And do I truly want the Iron Throne? Or do I want the North's freedom?" Catelyn's eyes reflected moonlight as she turned to him. "You sought justice for your father, for all of us. The throne was never your ambition. You're a Stark of Winterfell, not a conqueror. But the choices are ours to make now. The realm has seen so much war, Robb. If we keep fighting, we'll only bury more sons and fathers. Perhaps you can find a path to peace, build alliances that protect the North and the Riverlands, maybe all the kingdoms." He remembered that the people followed him in part because of who his father was. Because Ned Stark had always been honorable. The North rallied around that memory. But the day might come when he needed to place the crown upon his head, for the sake of holding the realm together and preventing another cycle of war. He exhaled. "Peace," he echoed. "Do you believe it's possible?" Catelyn gazed over the sleeping city. "With wise counsel, yes, but it will not be easy. You'll have to decide what to do with Joffrey, with Cersei, whether to offer clemency or the headsman's sword, how to handle Tyrion." Robb closed his eyes, thinking of the injustice that cost Ned his life. Should Joffrey face the same fate? The notion of mercy warred with the desire for retribution. "They must answer for their crimes," he said at last. "Yet I am wary of turning them into martyrs or sparking more uprisings from Lannister bannermen. I also remember Sansa's pleas for clemency. Though she no longer loves the boy, she's just seen enough death." Catelyn laid a hand on his arm. "Whatever you decide, do so as a king who would rule justly, not as a vengeful son. That is how you honor your father's memory." Her words lingered in Robb's mind long after she left him to the night's silence. The following morning, Robb convened a brief meeting in the throne room. The Iron Throne still stood vacant, a looming presence no one had dared to occupy. Robb took his place on the steps, flanked by guards bearing the Stark banner. Cersei and Joffrey were brought forth in chains. Joffrey was unkempt, eyes red-rimmed from sobbing. Cersei wore a tattered gown, her hair a tangled mess, yet she managed to hold herself with some semblance of regal bearing. A hush fell over those gathered, northern lords, city watch captains, and curious onlookers. Robb regarded them both with a steady gaze, gray wind at his feet. "Joffrey Baratheon," he said, voice echoing off stone. "You stand accused of treason, murder, and the unlawful execution of Eddard Stark, who was Hand of the King. You claimed the Iron Throne but were never the trueborn son of King Robert Baratheon. How do you answer these charges?" Joffrey's lips twisted. He made a strangled sound, glancing to his mother. Cersei began to speak, but Robb silenced her with a gesture. This was Joffrey's moment to speak. The boy swallowed. My father was the king," he said weakly, though no one believed it. "You're all traitors." Robb set his jaw. "There will be a trial," he declared. "You will have a chance to speak for yourself, though the evidence of your crimes is plain. Until then, you remain my prisoner." He looked at Cersei. "Cersei Lannister, you are accused alongside your son. Your father and your brother waged war on the North. You stand accused of conspiracy to commit regicide and the execution of Lord Stark as well." Cersei's lips pulled into a sneer. "A farce. You've seized the city by force of arms, and you dare to talk of trials? The realm will not stand for a usurper from the savage North." Murmurs rose from the crowd. Robb's expression hardened. "You will be confined under guard as Joffrey is. The trial will come soon. Remove them." At Robb's command, guards dragged the protesting pair out of the hall. Cersei's cursing and Joffrey's shouts echoed long after they vanished through the doors. In the uneasy silence, Robb turned to the assembled lords. "Spread word. The Lannister regime has ended. I, Robb of House Stark, hold King's Landing. Let all who wish to treat for peace come forth. Let all who would challenge me consider the blood that's already been spilled. The realm is in turmoil, and I offer terms to those who lay down their arms." A collective exhale seemed to shift through the gathering. Some nodded in agreement, others stood stiff, uncertain. When the hall emptied, Robb sank onto the bottom step of the Iron Throne's dais, fatigue evident. Gray Wind pressed close, muzzle resting on his knee, as if offering comfort. One of his guards approached with a bowed head, announcing that Tyrion Lannister had requested an audience. Robb considered. Tyrion was cunning, but perhaps he could be useful in navigating the labyrinth of southern politics. "Show him in." Tyrion entered under close watch, wrists unbound though flanked by guards. He bowed with exaggerated courtesy. "You asked me once to yield, and I did. Now you hold the keys to the kingdom, it seems. I trust you've heard from your mother how great an annoyance I can be, but that I can also be somewhat helpful." Robb stood, motioning the guards to remain by the door. "Speak your piece." Tyrion rubbed at his wrists. "I have no love for Joffrey. Never did. My father used me mostly for political cunning, then dismissed me when it suited him. I was hand of the king for a time, a figurehead, though I did what I could to keep the city from total collapse." He paused. "I propose you let me assist in running King's Landing. I know the houses, the moneylenders, the little birds, the labyrinth that is this place. I can help you keep order, re-establish trade, even quell resentments." Robb studied him. "And in return?" "Amnesty," Tyrion said simply. "For myself. For those who followed me in good faith. I'd like to live, to remain free, perhaps even hold a small seat of power if that's not too unthinkable. If not, I'll likely be executed alongside Joffrey once the trial begins. Yes, maybe I'll be locked up in a tower for the rest of my days. I'd rather avoid that." Robb's jaw tightened. "And why should I trust you? You're a Lannister. You might plot revenge." "You could also look at it another way," Tyrion answered, crossing his arms. "I'm a Lannister who knows all the ways my family might try to sabotage you. I can help you see them coming. Tywin is dead. Kevin might want vengeance, or he might be wise enough to bend the knee. It's hard to say. If you truly want stability, you'll want someone who can navigate these waters. There are only so many things that swords can accomplish. But knowledge." He tapped his temple. "Knowledge is power." Robb hesitated. Was this a trap? Tyrion certainly possessed the cunning to orchestrate a double-cross, but it was equally likely he simply wanted to preserve his own life. Tyrion was known to have protected Sansa from harsher treatment. He'd also tried to mitigate Joffrey's worst impulses. Finally, Robb nodded. "I'll consider your offer. For now, you remain in custody, but your rooms will be made more comfortable. If you truly mean to help me, you'll have your chance to prove it." Tyrion bowed. "I'm at your service, Lord Stark? Or should I say, your grace?" His tone was wry, but Robb did not smile. The days stretched into weeks. Peace was a fragile bird perched on a sword's edge. Ravens came from the Vale, from the Reach, from Dorne. The Vale, under Lady Lisa Arryn, responded that they would not contest the Northmen so long as their borders were respected. The Tyrells sent word. They would consider supporting Robb if certain terms were met, including a potential marriage alliance with Marjorie, or else they might remain neutral or side with Stannis. Dorne was silent, though rumors said Prince Doran Martell watched with quiet interest, remembering his own family's losses. Stannis Baratheon remained brooding in Dragonstone, employing a small fleet to harass shipping lanes. The Iron Islands threatened to take advantage of the realm's disarray, raiding the coasts. Holding King's Landing was one thing. Bringing peace to the realm was quite another. Meanwhile, trials were organized. A panel of Northern and Riverland lords sat in judgment, though the final word was Robb's to give. For lesser crimes, men received sentences ranging from service to restitution to exile. For those who had committed atrocities, the punishment was harsher. Joffrey's trial drew the greatest attention. Witnesses came forward with accounts of his brutal reign, how he tormented Sansa, had Ned Stark executed despite confession, unleashed violence on the common folk. Joffrey screamed about his birthright, threatened all with death, but his tantrums only sealed his fate. On the Day of Judgment, Robb announced that Joffrey Baratheon was guilty of murder, treason, and sundry horrors. The crowd roared approval, though a few looked on with pity, seeing a boy who had never been taught empathy. Robb, heart-pounding, remembered his mother's counsel. He contemplated mercy, but he also remembered the thousands who had died because of Joffrey's orders, including Ned Stark. He spoke quietly yet firmly. "You took my father's head. You offered cruelty where you could have shown compassion. You brought war on the realm to satisfy your lust for power. By the laws of gods and men, you are guilty." Joffrey's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'm the king. You can't." But Robb raised a hand to silence him. "I sentence you to die." And so it was done. The following morning, on the same platform where Ned Stark had been beheaded, Joffrey Baratheon was executed. Robb did not flinch from the duty. He swung the sword himself as Ned once taught him. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. The crowd watched in tense silence as the blade separated Joffrey's head from his body. No cheers, no curses. Just a hush, as though the city itself could hardly believe it. The realm had changed in that moment. Cersei's screams were heard through the Red Keep. She was to be tried as well, though now she was inconsolable and half-mad with grief and rage. Her own trial followed soon after. Numerous accusations were laid against her, not least her complicity in Ned Stark's death and the raising of arms against the North. Tyrion Lannister was brought forth as a witness, telling of her intrigues. Cersei snarled at him like a cornered lioness, but her pride had no power in a court that demanded justice. She was found guilty, yet in a gesture of mercy, perhaps to distinguish himself from the cruelty that had reigned. Robb spared her life, sentencing her to confinement in a distant keep, stripped of all titles and possessions. Many Northerners clamored for her head, but Robb made a choice to show the realm a different path. Mercy, tempered with strength. Cersei's parting glance at Robb was venomous. "You should have killed me," she whispered as guards dragged her away. "You'll regret this." Her words clung to him, but he forced himself to move on. Time marched forward. With the Lannisters' primary leadership in ruins, many Western lords sent ravens hoping to negotiate. They had no desire to continue a war without Tywin or Kevin's leadership. A few, like the Mountain Gregor Clegane, remained at large, rumored to be pillaging the countryside. Robb commanded search parties to find and subdue any remnants of Lannister loyalists who clung to violence. In the capital, the slow, painful work of restoration began. The Red Keep had suffered damage in the fighting, and swathes of the city still smoldered from scattered fires. But with careful leadership and the cooperation of local guilds, the roads cleared, market stalls reopened, and a shaky normalcy took root. Catelyn directed aid to orphans and refugees. Sansa assisted her, determined to bring kindness to a city that had given her so much heartbreak. She visited the Great September of Baelor, praying for Arya's safe return, for Bran and Rickon in Winterfell, for all they had lost. And Robb? Each day he wrestled with the question of the throne. The Great John demanded that he claim it outright. Bolton remained ambiguous, quietly pressing for power. Edmure Tully advised caution. The Riverlands were tired of war. Some lords from the Crownlands and Stormlands began approaching, testing how they might fare under a new king. Others waited to see if Stannis would sail from Dragonstone or if the Tyrells would march from Highgarden. Tyrion Lannister, now serving as an advisor under careful watch, said, "You hold the city. The people see you as their new king in all but name. Whether you want the title or not, you'll need to wear the crown if you wish to prevent chaos. Men need a symbol to rally around." Robb stood in what remained of the small council chamber, eyeing Tyrion. "My father never taught me to crave this. He always said the Iron Throne was a viper's nest, that the North was our responsibility." Tyrion smirked, raising a goblet of watered wine to his lips. "You cannot simply walk away now. If you do, it leaves a power vacuum. Others will fight for it, Stannis, the Tyrells, perhaps even a Targaryen girl across the sea with dragons. The war will continue until the realms are drowned in blood. Like it or not, you have responsibilities now. The city is in your hands. Robb turned to gaze out the window at the city that spread from the heights of the Red Keep. Catelyn's words echoed in his mind, about forging a path to peace. He felt the weight of every decision pressing down like a collar of iron. "Then let it be so," he said quietly, more to himself than to Tyrion. "But if I am to be king, I'll rule with the values my father taught me. Justice, honor, and mercy when warranted. I will not be another tyrant on that throne." Time brought an ever wider shift. The small folk began to speak of the Wolf King, who was stern but fair, who fed the hungry and punished criminals without prejudice. Others still whispered fears that the Northmen were savage barbarians who'd impose northern gods upon them. But as bread rations were distributed and the Watch resumed normal patrols, the city's mood gradually improved. Ravens flew in from the north, bearing news that Winterfell stood, albeit damaged after the Ironborn occupation. Robb's younger brothers, Bran and Rickon, were reportedly alive and hidden away, though the details were vague. Word of Theon Greyjoy's treachery still burned in Robb's mind, but that was a matter for another day. For now, he could only secure the realm at large. Bit by bit, alliances formed. The Tyrells, gauging the situation, proposed negotiations. Marjorie Tyrell, keen to be queen, sought a marriage pact with Robb, though Robb's heart was heavy over personal losses and vows he'd made. He hesitated, unsure if that was the right path. The Tyrells offered grain to feed kings, landing in exchange for a high seat at court. The realm began to feel the edges of peace. Stannis Baratheon tested the waters with small raids, but soon realized that without broad support from other lords, he couldn't wrest kings landing from Robb's formidable alliance. The Iron Islands, sensing renewed unity on the mainland, pulled back their raids. The Lannister name lost much of its terror with Tywin and Joffrey gone, Cersei in exile, and Jaime Lannister still captive or missing from the city. Some said he was in the Riverlands, searching for a way to free his sister and nephew, only to find them taken. One evening, Robb stood before the Iron Throne, now repaired, candles casting dancing shadows on its twisted swords. A hush fell in the hall as northern lords and city notables gathered. Edmure Tully, Catelyn Stark, Tyrion Lannister, and even representatives from the Tyrells looked on. Sansa watched with tears in her eyes, her pale hands clasped in front of her. Slowly, Robb climbed the steps. Each footfall resonated in his mind as a step away from his old life as the heir to Winterfell and toward something unknown. At the top, he turned. The throne was behind him, an unspoken promise of power and burden. He looked over the men and women who had fought and bled and lost so much. He saw in their eyes a desperate need for stability. Catelyn came forward, tears shimmering. She carried a simple circlet of dark steel, inlaid with the dire wolf of House Stark. Not the glittering gold crown of the Baratheons, nor a dragon-forged circlet. It was northern in its simplicity. She placed it in his hands, voice trembling as she said, "If you would be king, wear this in a manner that honors your father's memory and protects the realm from further ruin." Robb's throat felt tight. He heard the hush around him, a heartbeat of a kingdom waiting. He raised the circlet over his head, feeling a cold prickle at his scalp as he set it down. The hall erupted in cheers from many throats, though some voices remained quiet, uncertain. Robb Stark, the young wolf, had become a king before their eyes. He drew a breath, heart hammering. "I take this crown not for glory, but for duty," he said, voice carrying across the hall. "I swear to rule with justice, protect the weak, and uphold the honor that House Stark has always stood for." A wave of acclamations washed over him, though he could still sense the tension beneath. This was a new dawn for the Seven Kingdoms, or at least for those that would follow him. Whether they would remain seven or splinter further, time alone would tell. But the first step had been taken. In the days that followed, preparations were made for an official coronation ceremony to legitimize Robb's rule in the eyes of the Crownlands and beyond. Delegates arrived from various regions, some simply to witness the new power structure, others seeking favor or bargains. Tyrion Lannister quietly, persistently advised Robb on who to trust and who to watch. The entire city, once ravaged by fear, found itself in a restless swirl of diplomacy. Sansa tried to find her place in the new court. She was no longer a hostage, but a princess of the north in a southern kingdom that still didn't feel like home. She often prayed that Arya might be found, that their family could be reunited. She stayed close to Catelyn, who gently guided her in the ways of dealing with courtiers and the small folk who came to petition. Robb worked tirelessly, rarely sleeping more than a few hours. He met with lords who had once served Joffrey, ensuring they bent the knee or faced the consequences. He oversaw repairs to the city walls, mindful that an outside threat could still appear. He directed grain shipments to ensure the people wouldn't starve. The weight of the realm pressed on him, and he missed the quiet snows of Winterfell. One afternoon, as the sun slanted in through the high windows of the Great Hall, Tyrion approached Robb with a letter. "Raven from Pike," he said, handing it over. "It appears that Balon Greyjoy has died. Some accident on a bridge in a storm, or so they say. Euron Greyjoy has returned to the Iron Islands. A new headache for you, possibly." Robb read the brief words, lips thinning. The Ironborn were known to exploit any sign of weakness. Euron, the infamous Crow's Eye, was rumored to be more dangerous than Balon ever was. "We'll deal with him if he becomes a threat." Tyrion's lips curved in a half-smile. "Such is the burden of kingship, I suppose. Troubles from every corner. Yet if you build alliances with the Tyrells, perhaps Dorne, you might hold them at bay." Robb nodded, though the idea of marrying for alliance rather than love still made him uneasy. He thought of the girl from the Westerlands he'd once given his word to, in a different story. The war had parted them, and the demands of the realm might keep them apart forever. Duty overshadowed his personal wishes now. In a quiet moment, he admitted as much to his mother. Catelyn gently stroked his hair as if he were a boy again. "If marrying Marjorie Tyrell ensures the security of the North and the peace of the realm, then perhaps that is the sacrifice you must make," she said. "Your father wed for an alliance in some ways. He grew to love me and I him. It may yet be that you will find comfort, if not happiness." Robb sighed, running a hand over the crown that felt too heavy. "It will never bring back the dead. No, but it may prevent more from joining them." The coronation day dawned clear and bright, a rarity for King's Landing. The great September of Baelor had been scrubbed and cleansed, or as much as possible given the war's toll. High Septon stood ready, though he held no love for the old gods. Still, this was the tradition in the south and the people needed a symbol. Robb wore the circlet of dark steel. Sansa and Catelyn were at his side, along with lords from the north and the Riverlands, representatives from the Crownlands, and even a small delegation from Highgarden. A hush settled as Robb Stark stepped into the September. As an acknowledgement to the faith of the Seven, he allowed the High Septon to perform a blessing, though it felt strange to him, raised in the old god's ways. Still, the pageantry soothed the city. Inside, candles flickered, reflecting on polished marble. Painted glass windows cast colored light onto the floor, where the audience had gathered in hushed silence. When the moment came, Robb knelt before the altar. The High Septon anointed him with holy oils, invoking the Father, the Warrior, the Smith. Then Robb rose, the circlet balanced atop his head. The pronouncement was made, "All hail King Robb of House Stark, first of his name, King of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm." Cheers, less thunderous than he might have imagined, yet still resonant, rolled through the September. Robb inhaled, feeling the press of the realm settle on his shoulders. He was king, by right of conquest and the trembling acceptance of the southern lords who had no appetite for further war. When he left the Sept, the city outside erupted in a mixture of cheers and anxious murmuring. Robb forced a smile, raising a hand to greet them. Sansa stood close, tears glistening in her eyes, uncertain of what the future might hold. Catelyn placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The direwolf banners waved in the breeze, dancing in the sunlight. That night, Feasting filled the halls of the Red Keep, though the mood was far from carefree. People were exhausted from war, and the fare was simpler than the lavish spreads of previous courts. Still, there was ale, bread, a roasted boar. Music played. Sansa danced once. Smile on her lips, longing for simpler times at Winterfell. Robb accepted well-wishers, trying to appear confident, but every so often, his eyes flicked toward the shadows, as though expecting an assassin or an outraged southern lord. Tyrion cornered Robb with a cup of wine in hand. "Congratulations, Your Grace. I do hope you have a plan for the rather large debts left behind by my father's regime, not to mention the debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos." He sipped. "Kings rarely get to rest easy." Robb suppressed a weary sigh. "I'll deal with them. Perhaps the Lannister gold you boasted of might help." Tyrion chuckled. "I fear that gold is not as plentiful as rumor suggests, but we can talk. For now, enjoy your feast. You'll have many nights ahead poring over ledgers." So it went. A swirl of problems and uncertain hopes. King Robb Stark, the young wolf, had seized King's Landing in a tide of blood, ended the Lannister hold, and begun a new reign. Whether the realm would remain at peace, whether the North would truly benefit from this, whether he might find a queen who could share his burdens, these questions dangled like puppets on tangled strings. He thought often of Ned, who had disdained the Game of Thrones. Yet here Robb stood at its center, forging a new story that the bards might sing of, if winter's chill did not swallow them first. He pondered how history would remember this moment. The day a Stark took the Iron Throne. Would they hail him as a savior king who brought justice and mercy to a realm in turmoil? Or would they curse him as a conqueror who spilled blood for a crown he never wanted? Only time would reveal the answers. For now, the direwolf sigil fluttered above the Red Keep, gray on a field of white, a promise that the North had risen, and that perhaps, through struggle and sacrifice, a new order might yet be shaped. A restless hush fell over King's Landing in the days that followed Robb Stark's coronation. That first morning after he was proclaimed king in the Great September of Baelor, the city seemed to hold its breath. The dawn light revealed banners of the direwolf flapping above the Red Keep, the cobblestones still dark with old blood, and a populace caught between hope and fear. Even now, the threat of chaos lingered at every corner. Soldiers patrolled with a grim resolve, stamping boot prints onto the muddy streets, while black carrion birds circled overhead, drawn by the aftermath of battle. Smoke from smoldering debris rose in lazy curls, a reminder that the war's scars would not vanish overnight. Robb woke before the sun, weighed down by the reality of kingship. In his chamber, once reserved for kings of House Targaryen, House Baratheon, and then the Lannisters, he dressed in clothes still simple compared to southern finery. A dark tunic with gray trim, sturdy breeches, boots meant for rough terrain. He fastened the faintly gleaming circlet of dark steel around his head, the metal cold on his brow, and paused in the half-light. Outside, gray wind waited for him, massive paws scratching idly on the stone floor, tail swishing in a silent sentinel's stance. The direwolf's keen eyes watched his master, reflecting a primal wisdom that made Robb wonder if the old gods were seeing through those lupin orbs. Catelyn Stark waited for her son in the corridor, a candle flickering in the gloom. She wore no jewels, only the pin of House Tully on her breast, silver fish on a field of red and blue. Her face, always fair, had taken on new lines of care over the past months, and the grief for Ned Stark still darkened her eyes. Yet when she saw Robb emerge, wearing that northern crown, she curved her lips in a sad, proud smile. "You have a busy day before you," she said softly, tightening the shawl around her shoulders. "The City Watch has requested an audience, and certain lords from the Crownlands wish to present themselves. Then there's the matter of the war-torn houses in the Riverlands who want redress. Edmure is already investigating." Robb set a hand on his mother's arm. "I'll see them all, though the days grow no longer simply because I've a crown." "When is the council assembled?" "They wait for you in the small council chamber," she said. "Tyrion Lannister is there, and so is Roose Bolton. I believe Ser Brynden is also present, though he arrived late in the night." Robb's expression lightened a fraction at the mention of his great-uncle Brynden Tully, the Blackfish. Good. Uncle Bryndon's counsel is always welcome. When they reached the small council chamber, a single guard pushed open the heavy oak door. Robb entered first, gray wind gliding in silently at his side, and found a gathering of men who all turned to acknowledge him with bows or solemn nods. The chamber smelled of parchment, lamp oil, and the faint, stale odor of Lannister perfume that lingered in the draperies. The table, large enough for a dozen, bore scattered maps and half-empty wine cups. Tyrion Lannister was seated near the head of the table, wearing a neutral expression. Behind him stood Bronn, the Sellsword-turned captain, who had once been Tyrion's personal guard. Now he wore no gold cloak, but a new gray and black surcoat under sufferance of the new regime. Bronn regarded Robb with the same cool confidence he showed everyone, though he remained silent. Tyrion himself inclined his head. "Good morrow, your grace. I trust the day finds you well rested." Robb took his seat, conscious that the higher back chair had once been reserved for the king or the hand. He did not feel comfortable there yet, but circumstance allowed no refusal. "Well enough," he said, scanning the faces around him. "Uncle Brynden, Roose Bolton, Lord Vance, Lord Mouton, welcome." Edmure Tully was absent for the moment, likely dealing with urgent matters in the Riverlands. Lord Bolton offered a slight bow from his seat, pale eyes betraying nothing. "Your Grace," he said, "we've word from the outskirts of the city. Some pockets of Sellswords are banding together, no doubt seeing an opportunity in the aftermath. My men are containing them, but it's a process." Robb nodded. "Do what you must to keep the peace. I want no cruelty against the small folk. The Sellswords who lay down arms may be questioned, and if they've shed innocent blood, they'll stand trial. If not, they can leave or swear fealty." Bolton inclined his head, a ghost of a smile flickering. "Of course." Tyrion cleared his throat. "An excellent beginning, your grace. That leads me to the matter of the city's debt to the Iron Bank of Bravos. We owe a monstrous sum from the previous regime. My esteemed father was liberal with his borrowing, as was Robert Baratheon before him. The Iron Bank grows impatient when interest is not paid." Robb's lips pressed into a flat line. "I'm aware. How much do we owe?" Tyrion's mismatched eyes gleamed, though he spoke soberly. "Enough that even if you melted down the gold in the Red Keep's vaults, you'd barely cover a third. Unless you plan on raising taxes so sharply that the city riots anew, we'll need a strategy. Loans from wealthier houses, forging new alliances with the Tyrells." At that moment, another figure stepped in. Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, a veteran warrior with gray in his hair and an unyielding set to his mouth. "Apologies, your grace," he said. "I was detained by some men on the drawbridge." Robb gestured for him to sit. "We were discussing the Iron Bank. Tyrion believes alliances might ease the burden." Brynden grunted. "Alliances always come with conditions. We do have the gold mines of the Westerlands under question, do we not? With Lannister power broken, who truly holds Casterly Rock?" Tyrion exhaled. "My uncle Kevin holds it by default, unless it's been seized by forces loyal to House Stark. But Kevin is prudent, let us say. He may not be eager to start another war. If you dispatch someone to treat with him, you might secure the mines, assuming my family doesn't resent being unseated from the crown." A tension-laden pause followed. The notion of claiming Lannister gold made many in the room uneasy. Robb studied Tyrion, who offered a tight, knowing smile. Tyrion's greatest loyalty, if he had any left, might be to his own survival. Yet Robb could not afford to discard the dwarf's counsel out of hand. Too many pitfalls lay ahead. "If Kevin Lannister refuses an accord," Robb said, "then we may have no choice but to press him. But I'd prefer negotiation. War is the last resort. Lord Bolton, see that a raven is sent to Casterly Rock, requesting a parley with Kevin Lannister. Let him know that Joffrey and Tywin are gone, and that House Stark seeks peace, provided the West no longer threatens the North or the Riverlands." Bolton dipped his head. "As you command." Brynden Tully's dark eyes flicked around the table. And what of Stannis Baratheon? The man has a fleet at Dragonstone, and I hear rumors that he's paid off some Lyseni pirates. He may be preparing a strike. Tyrion jumped in. Stannis is a persistent fellow. If he believes he's the rightful king, by virtue of being Robert's brother, he won't sit idle while a Stark rules in King's Landing. We can expect a challenge eventually. That may be... Robb allowed his voice tight. But for now, Stannis lacks the numbers to storm the city, especially after what happened in the Battle of the Blackwater. He'll look for an opening. We'll keep watch. Remind our loyal ships along the Blackwater Bay to remain vigilant. Through it all, Catelyn stood near the wall, silent but attentive. She noticed the subtle ripple of nervousness at the mention of Stannis. None at the table had forgotten how King's Landing had nearly fallen to him once, saved only by Tyrion's cunning use of wildfire, and eventually by Tywin's arrival with the Tyrells. That victory was undone by the North's subsequent campaign, which ended in the downfall of the Lannisters, yet Stannis had not simply vanished. He might be the next storm on the horizon. When the meeting ended, Robb and his companions filtered out into the corridor. The hush that followed them was thick with unspoken tensions. For every problem they addressed, 3 more lingered, as though the realm were a hydra that regrew heads whenever one was lopped off. Robb paused in the hallway, allowing the flow of courtiers and retainers to pass around him like a tide. Gray wind lingered at his side, muzzle lifted to scent the air. Sansa Stark appeared, emerging from the shadows near a tall window that let in dusty sunlight. Her hair, once an innocent auburn, had darkened through grief and hardship. She wore a pale gown and carried herself with a quiet dignity that had not existed before her captivity under the Lannisters. "Brother," she said softly, curtsying. Her eyes, once so bright with girlish dreams, looked older now. "May I have a word?" Robb nodded and motioned for Catelyn to join them. The 3 Starks found a smaller solar, one with a wide balcony that overlooked the rooftops descending toward Flea Bottom. The air smelled faintly of smoke and the distant tang of the sea. Sansa folded her hands. "I wanted to thank you for all you've done to bring justice. When Joffrey was executed, I thought I would feel only relief, but there was something else, too. A sadness, maybe. He was cruel, but he was a boy, and everything about this city is so complicated." Robb exhaled, resting his palms on the balcony's edge. "He brought it upon himself. Still, I understand. He was young, but with too much power and no kindness taught. I hope Father would approve of the manner in which we carried out justice. I did the deed myself as Father taught me." Sansa looked away, eyes glistening. "Father, so many memories of him, of the day he died." She took a shaky breath. "I just want to be sure you're all right, Robb. I see how much this burdens you." Catelyn placed a hand on Sansa's shoulder. "Your brother carries a heavy weight, but he is strong. We are Starks. We endure." Robb summoned a smile, though it felt paper-thin. "I'm doing my best. I'm thinking about sending for Bran and Rickon if it's safe. They belong at Winterfell, but perhaps..." He paused, uncertain if bringing them south was wise. Winterfell had to be rebuilt. The North needed its own seat. And yet, if he were to remain in King's Landing as a Southern king, what of the North? Sansa guessed at his thoughts. "You might rule in the South, but your heart is in the North. It always has been. Maybe you can find a way to let the North be free while you hold the rest of the realm. Or is that impossible?" He gave a faint shrug. "I don't know. The Lords might not stand for it. The cost would be endless conflict if I tried to separate the North completely while also claiming the Iron Throne. Perhaps the best compromise is to keep the kingdoms united but allow the North more autonomy." Catelyn nodded. "Whatever you decide, Robb, you'll have to navigate the great houses carefully. Some in the South might prefer the old arrangement, where the North was simply a distant region paying taxes and sending men when commanded. Others won't care so long as you maintain the peace." Sansa offered a small, hopeful smile. "If peace is truly possible, then that is all I want. For the city to stop drowning in fear, for the people not to starve, for the North to recover from war." Do you think we can have that? Robb's gaze traveled out over the city. We will try, he said, sounding older than his years. That's all we can do. He parted from Sansa and Catelyn soon after, striding through the Red Keep's corridors where hushed servants pressed themselves to walls to let him pass. The newly minted king of the Seven Kingdoms, or so the formal style went, though some still whispered king in the north. He wondered if he deserved either title. Outside the main gates, a large market square had been repurposed for distributing bread and fish to the small folk. The entire area bustled under the watchful eyes of northern guards. Robb saw Great John Umber, huge and ruddy-faced, standing near an overturned cart, bellowing at someone to mind their place in the queue. The Great John, once so boisterous, had tempered only slightly since the conquest, but he remained loyal. Nearby, House Mormont's banner hung limp in the mild breeze. A handful of Mormont women, tall and broad-shouldered, helped supervise the line of hungry small folk. Robb felt a twist in his gut to see so many drawn faces, children with hollow cheeks, old women clutching tattered cloaks. He dismounted from his borrowed horse. His own had died in the final push into the city, and walked among them with a quiet gravity. Whispers spread. The Wolf King is here. Men removed caps or knelt, though many simply stared, uncertain. When he spoke to them, hearing their grievances, roofs burned, shops destroyed, children lost in the chaos, he offered words of reassurance. He promised that repairs would be organized, that there would be justice. Yet with each promise he felt the weight grow heavier. A child, no more than 6, gazed up at him with wide, fearful eyes. Her hair was matted, her face smudged. She clutched a withered turnip. Robb knelt to her level, the circlet on his head gleaming under the midday sun. "What's your name?" She blinked, shaking. "Mari," she managed. He smiled softly, trying to put her at ease. "Mari, you needn't be afraid. We'll have fresh bread for you. Is there anyone who takes care of you?" She glanced around, tears pricking her eyes. "My mother died in the fighting. My father's gone. I don't know if he's alive." Robb felt his throat tighten. All the horrors of war were condensed into this child's trembling words. He looked over his shoulder at one of the Mormont women. "Find her a place in the orphan shelter. Make sure she has enough to eat, and keep an ear out for her father if he shows." The woman bowed curtly. "As you command, Your Grace." He rose then, feeling the child's gaze lingering on him as she was gently led away. What did it mean to be a king if he could not stop children from suffering? His father had taught him that leadership was about protecting those who could not protect themselves, but war had destroyed so much. The day moved on with brutal swiftness. He returned to the Red Keep to oversee a round of petitions in the throne room. Many of those who came forward were small folk or lesser knights who had disputes over stolen livestock, burned fields, lost wages. Others were wealthier merchants demanding compensation for Lannister-era taxes or for wagons seized in the war effort. Robb listened, offering judgments that strove for fairness, though he knew some cases were beyond resolution with a wave of his hand. The line stretched on for hours, and by the time the last petitioner had departed, the sun was setting in an orange haze over the Blackwater Rush. He dismissed the guards with a nod, telling them he'd remain in the throne room a moment longer. The tall, vaulted chamber was empty now, dimly lit by torches. The Iron Throne loomed at the far side, that mass of melted swords from Aegon's conquest. It was said no king could sit upon it comfortably, for it was meant to remind them that ruling was never easy. Robb had to agree. He stepped toward it, footsteps echoing off the stone. Gray wind paced behind him, muzzle lifted in a silent question. Robb placed a hand on the throne's arm, the rough edges of hammered metal scraping his palm. He could imagine the ghosts of all who had ruled here. Aegon Targaryen, Maegor the Cruel, the Mad King Aerys, Robert Baratheon, Joffrey. Each had shaped the realm, often by violence. Now, in a twist of fate, a Stark sat in their place. Was it prideful to think he might do better? Or was it folly to believe any man could bring lasting peace to these fractious lands? Exhaustion tugged at him. He knew he should rest, but sleep rarely granted him solace. Too many nightmares. He turned away from the throne, intending to return to his chambers, when a voice echoed across the hall. "Your Grace." He spun to see Roose Bolton, silent as a ghost in the gloom. The man wore his usual colors, pale pink, with the flayed man of House Bolton. The flickering torchlight gave his face a sinister cast, though it was always somewhat unnerving. "Lord Bolton," Robb said, voice echoing. "Is something amiss?" Bolton shook his head. "Only that I wish to share news. A rider came with dispatches from Riverrun. It seems your uncle Edmure has discovered more Lannister loyalists hidden in the Red Fork region. They attacked a Tully supply train. Several men died. Edmure requests reinforcements." Robb frowned. "Then we'll send them. I can spare a few hundred men from the City Watch now that discipline is improving." "How soon can they be dispatched?" "I can arrange it tonight." Bolton's tone was cordial but cool. "I'll also advise the men to show no mercy if these are brigands refusing to yield." Robb's voice turned steely. "They're outlaws if they're raiding supply trains. But I don't want a slaughter of peasants who might just be hungry. We need to differentiate between bandits and war criminals. The latter must be punished, yes, but not everyone scrounging for scraps is a rebel." Bolton inclined his head, expression unreadable. "As you say, Your Grace, I will relay your orders." He paused, then stepped a fraction closer. "There is also the matter of the Dreadfort. I've had word from my son, Ramsay, who remains in the north. He grows concerned about possible Ironborn raids near the Stony Shore. He requests leave to deal with them as he sees fit." Robb felt an involuntary shiver. He knew of Ramsay Snow, now Ramsay Bolton, if Roose had legally acknowledged him. His reputation was foul, rumors of cruelty that far exceeded what was typical even in war. "I'd prefer you instruct him to coordinate with Lord Manderley or the Glovers, not to wage a private war. The Ironborn have pulled back for now, but we remain vigilant. I've not forgotten that Theon Greyjoy once betrayed my family." Bolton's pale eyes flickered. "As you will, Your Grace. I'll send a raven tonight." Robb dismissed Bolton with a courteous nod and felt vaguely relieved when the man exited. His footsteps muffled on the stone floor. In the silence left behind, Robb reminded himself that Bolton had aided him in the storming of King's Landing, although in one version of events, the Boltons had turned traitor at the Red Wedding. But that betrayal had never occurred in this altered path. That did not guarantee unwavering loyalty. He had to watch Roose Bolton closely, for the man was cunning, and the stories about his son were even darker. Still, the pressing matter was the realm at large, and so he left the throne room. In the corridors, a group of Stark bannermen approached Robb, escorting a caged figure. Closer inspection revealed a hulking man, his arms corded with muscle, wearing a collar of iron that marked him a captive. One of the escorts, a grizzled spearman, inclined his head. "Your Grace, we found this man skulking in the alleyways near Flea Bottom. Says his name is Polliver, a Sellsword who served under Gregor Clegane. He's wounded but put up a fight." Polliver, a face that stirred a flicker of memory. Robb recalled the name from the lists of men who had been with the Mountain, a group that had terrorized the Riverlands. Arya might have encountered him, or so the rumors once said. He studied the prisoner's bruised face, the shadow of fear behind his eyes. "You served Gregor Clegane?" Polliver spat blood. "We were men of the Lannisters, but that's no matter now. I just want to live. I'll swear loyalty if you let me go." Robb's gut twisted with disgust. Men like Polliver had committed atrocities, if half the stories were true. Take him to a cell. We'll decide his fate after a proper interrogation. If he's guilty of crimes against the small folk, he'll hang. At a flick of Robb's fingers, the guards nodded and led the prisoner away. Robb stood in the corridor, the flickering torchlight throwing his shadow onto the wall, and felt a wave of weariness crash over him. The war's remnants lingered like a plague, men with blood on their hands crawling out of every shadow. He made his way back to his chambers with gray wind at his side, passing tired sentries who saluted. The corridors felt colder now that the fires had burned low. Inside his room, he lit a candle, inhaling the faint scent of beeswax. He removed the circlet, setting it on a table with a clink of steel. Gray wind curled up near the door, yawning to reveal a mouth full of formidable teeth. Robb sank into a chair, elbows on his knees, heart pounding. He thought of the day's tasks, the child Mari, the lines of petitioners, the cunning glance of Tyrion Lannister, the icy courtesy of Roose Bolton. He thought of Ned Stark, who had worn the cloak of responsibility so naturally, and wondered if he could ever live up to that standard. At some point, he drifted into a doze, haunted by fleeting dreams of Winterfell's snow-laden courtyard, of the broken tower where he and his siblings once played. His father stood on the battlements with a solemn gaze, and Robb tried to call out to him, but no sound emerged. He awoke with a start, sweat trickling down his temple. The candle burned halfway down. A quiet knock at the door made Grey Wind lift his head and growl softly. Robb opened it to see a messenger, a young man wearing the colors of House Tully. "Pardon, Your Grace, Lord Edmure just arrived from Riverrun. He asks if you can see him now." Robb rose, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course, have him wait in the solar." It was near midnight, but rest had become a luxury. He left Grey Wind behind for a moment. The direwolf was half asleep anyway, and crossed to the solar where Edmure Tully stood. The Lord of Riverrun was dusty from travel, tension etched in his features. His once boyish smile was absent, replaced by the severity of a man tested by war. They clasped forearms in greeting. "Uncle," Robb said, "I'm sorry you've had a rough ride. I heard about the raids on the supply lines." Edmure's lips tightened. "A band of Lannister loyalists calling themselves the Lions of the Red Fork. They're led by some lesser cousin of the Lannisters, a Ser Devane Lannister, I believe. They're well-armed, taking advantage of the chaos. My men have lost half a dozen good soldiers, and small folk have died by the score." Robb nodded grimly. "We'll send reinforcements, a few hundred men, to secure the roads and root them out. We can't have pockets of Lannister rebels undermining stability." "Agreed. Riverrun can't handle it alone. Our levies are exhausted." Edmure rubbed his brow. "Any chance you could come in person? Or must you stay in King's Landing?" The question lingered. Robb had once commanded armies on the field. He was an able strategist, he had to be, to outmaneuver Tywin Lannister in earlier battles. But now, wearing the crown, he faced new constraints. "I must stay for the moment. The city's stability is fragile, and the presence of the king is necessary to prevent further unrest. I'll trust you and Roose Bolton's combined efforts to put down the rebels. Keep me informed." Edmure accepted that with a short nod. "Understood. I'll rest here for a night, then return with the reinforcements at dawn." They spoke a bit more about provisioning and the infiltration of outlaws. Then Robb let Edmure retire, leaving him alone once more in the dimly lit solar. The desire to put on his armor and ride into battle himself flared strong. He felt more comfortable as a soldier than a monarch. Yet leaving King's Landing while the realm's lords watched like circling hawks would be folly. If he abandoned the capital even for a short while, someone else might slip a knife into the city's heart. He was needed here whether he liked it or not. The following morning arrived in a haze of gold and pink. Robb roused himself, donned his clothing, and placed the crown upon his head. He found his mother waiting with a letter in hand, her expression troubled. "A raven arrived from High Garden," she said. "It's from Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns. She proposes a match between you and her granddaughter Marjorie." Robb nodded wearily. Tyrion had predicted such a thing. The Tyrells sought to secure their influence in King's Landing by marriage. "What terms does she offer?" Catelyn glanced at the parchment. "She offers grain to feed the city, gold to help alleviate the Iron Bank's demands, and the full support of the Reach in your reign. In return, Marjorie becomes your queen. Olenna suggests spring or summer for the wedding, depending on the realm's stability." He exhaled, pacing across the room. "It's a sound alliance, but I'm reluctant. We both know I once broke my betrothal to a fry, and that led to tensions." He didn't speak of the red wedding that might have been, but in this reality was narrowly averted or changed by new circumstances. Still, it lingered like a bad dream in his mind. If I marry Marjorie, I might appease the South. But what of my personal vows from before? Catelyn's gaze was sympathetic. I know you cared for Talisa or Jane Westerling, depending on the path, but her family has no power now, and you have not seen her in many moons. The realm demands stability. A king must sometimes make a match that benefits his people. Your father married me for alliance as much as affection, yet we found love in time. He paused, thinking of the potential cost. What do you advise, mother? She hesitated. I advise caution, but also practicality. Marjorie is said to be gracious, beloved by the common folk. She might help you gain acceptance here. The Tyrell's support is crucial if you want to avoid another war. And she's certainly more appealing than some prospective brides you might be offered. Robb studied the letter once more, noticing how Olenna Tyrell's words combined sharp wit with a grandmotherly sense of practicality. Marjorie was rumored to have been betrothed to Renly, then married to Joffrey in another timeline or arrangement, but none of those unions truly took hold. Now fate had twisted again. He sighed. I'll write back expressing openness to the match, but I want to meet Marjorie first to judge her character. If we're to be bound, it must be with clear eyes, not blind acceptance. That's fair, Catelyn said gently. I'll dispatch your response today. She departed, and Robb stared after her, the letter still in hand. Another piece on the board. Another compromise forced by the crown he wore. He thought of the old gods and how they would see this union. Marrying beneath the weirwood's silent witness was the custom of the North. But here he was in a city of the Seven, forging alliances with a great southern house. Nothing felt simple anymore. Word spread quickly through the capital that King Robb Stark was entertaining the idea of marrying Marjorie Tyrell. Merchants gossiped in the wine sinks, gold cloaks whispered among themselves on patrol, and noble ladies eyed each other with speculation. The city had endured the upheaval of Joffrey's monstrous reign and abrupt downfall. A new royal wedding, especially one rumored to be less cruel, offered a strange mix of excitement and dread. Weddings at court had become ominous affairs in recent memory. Tyrion Lannister took the news with dry amusement, cornering Robb in the hall outside the small council chamber. So, the Rose of Highgarden extends its vines, he said with a half-smile. Wise enough. The Tyrells have the gold and the bread. You have the crown and the fierce northern warriors. It might be a fruitful marriage indeed. Robb remained wary. It might, or it might bring more entanglements than we realize. The Tyrells don't do anything without an advantage to themselves. Tyrion inclined his head. Indeed, but that can be said of all great houses, mine included, though it's uncertain how much of a great house the Lannisters remain at the moment. He studied Robb with a surprisingly thoughtful expression. If Marjorie arrives, I'd be happy to advise you on navigating Tyrell politics. I was once forcibly engaged to Sansa, remember? I've grown familiar with southern courtship. More than I ever wished. Robb gave him a measured look. I'll consider it. Meanwhile, the city's new normalcy faced its first test when a rumor circulated that a pair of red priests had arrived from the east, proclaiming that a new champion of R'hllor would soon appear to challenge all kings. Some said it was Stannis, who carried a flaming sword. Others muttered about Daenerys Targaryen across the sea, the mother of dragons. Robb took these rumors seriously but saw no immediate threat. He had too many urgent fires burning in the present to chase distant tales of dragons. Within a fortnight, more ravens arrived, one from Kevan Lannister at Casterly Rock. Kevan's tone was cool but civil. He acknowledged Joffrey's illegitimacy and offered an uneasy truce. If King Robb recognized the Lannisters' right to keep their western domains, they would swear not to rise against him. The gold mines were mentioned obliquely. Kevan implied that a share of their proceeds might be negotiated if House Stark forgave certain war debts. It was the closest thing to an olive branch that might come from the west. Robb pored over the letter with Tyrion, Brynden Tully, and Catelyn. Tyrion offered insight. My uncle Kevan is no fool. He won't want more bloodshed. He also won't want to see the West impoverished. If you play this carefully, you can secure a steady flow of gold in exchange for letting him remain Lord of Casterly Rock uncontested. Brynden pursed his lips. That may anger some of our men who yearn for vengeance against all Lannisters. Robb acknowledged this. True, but vengeance beyond what's been done does not help the realm. We have Joffrey, Tywin, and Cersei dealt with. Jaime is missing, presumably wandering or captured by someone else. The rest of them aren't worth burning the Western lands. Let them keep their seat if they bend the knee. I'll formally confirm Kevin as Lord Paramount of the Westerlands, and he'll provide a portion of gold to aid in rebuilding the crown's coffers. Tyrion offered a thin smile. It seems you're learning the game quickly, Your Grace. So, a carefully worded response was dispatched, and soon the framework of peace with the Westerlands began to settle. It was not friendship, but it was a step toward stability, one more corner of the realm less likely to break into revolt. The city's small folk, unaware of the letters crossing the land, noticed only that there were fewer corpses in the streets, fewer swords brandished at random. Bread remained scarce, but not as scarce as it had been. A hint of hope crept into daily life. Then, a messenger galloped in from the Rose Road. Margaery Tyrell and a retinue of her family were on the way to King's Landing, bringing wagons of supplies and an escort of mounted knights. They traveled slowly, perhaps wary of outlaws. The news spread like wildfire among the courtiers. The Tyrells were coming, presumably to formalize the betrothal to King Robb Stark. He received the announcement in the small council. "How many are with her?" he asked. "A large retinue, Your Grace. Some say hundreds of courtiers, knights, handmaidens, and wagons of gifts," the messenger reported. "They say Lord Mace Tyrell himself is accompanying her, though the Queen of Thorns, Olenna, might remain at Highgarden or might arrive later. Different rumors swirl." Tyrion chuckled. "You'll soon meet the Tyrell brood. Prepare yourself for flattery, feasts, and negotiations. They'll want to see you enthralled by Margaery's beauty and overshadowed by their presence." Robb sighed, rubbing his temple. "We'll host them properly. There's no point in causing offense at this stage. The city can certainly use the food and gold they bring." For days later, word arrived that the Tyrell party was just 2 leagues from the city, so Robb and a small entourage rode out to meet them by the gate. He wore clean black and gray attire, the crown resting on his hair, and carried himself with dignity. Beside him were Great John Umber, Brynden Tully, and a line of mounted knights bearing the direwolf banners. The day was hot, the sun glaring down from a cloudless sky. At last, the Tyrell escort appeared on the horizon, green and gold banners fluttering. A line of wagons followed, some carrying chests, others filled with covered cargo that might be grain or produce. Knights in shining armor flanked the train, their horses adorned with bright caparisons that bore the rose of House Tyrell. Leading the column was Mace Tyrell, his girth obvious even at a distance, and beside him rode a figure veiled in a pale green cloak. Robb guessed it was Margaery. The 2 parties drew close, halting amid a swirl of dust. Birds chirped from nearby scrub, strangely unafraid of the spectacle. Mace Tyrell, florid-faced and beaming, dismounted with some effort. He gave Robb a sweeping bow. "Your Grace, King Robb Stark, Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden, at your service. We come bearing gifts and are honored to witness your reign." Robb dipped his head slightly. "Welcome, Lord Tyrell. You've traveled far, and I'm grateful for your arrival." Mace gestured to the figure at his side. "May I present my daughter, Margaery Tyrell, the brightest flower of the Reach." Margaery removed her cloak's hood, revealing luminous brown hair intricately braided, framing a face that was both soft and quietly confident. She curtsied with a graceful bend. "Your Grace, it's an honor to meet you at last." Robb studied her, conscious of the hush that fell around them. She was comely, yes, with clear eyes that held a trace of curiosity and something else, an acute awareness of the power game unfolding. He offered a courteous nod and extended his hand. "Lady Margaery, welcome to the capital." She smiled, the corners of her lips tilting in a way that seemed genuine. "Thank you, Your Grace. We have much to discuss, and I hope to be of service to the realm in this time of transition." The formal greeting concluded, both sides remounted, and they rode together into King's Landing. Curious onlookers lined the streets, eager to glimpse the famed beauty from the south. Grain wagons and Tyrell horsemen followed, giving the impression of a traveling festival. Marjorie, riding side saddle, inclined her head kindly to the crowd, smiling at children who waved. Robb noticed that the people responded well to her warmth. It was a stark contrast to how they once cowered from Joffrey's cruelty. When they reached the Red Keep, Mace Tyrell's fussing began at once. He bemoaned the heat, the dust, the cramped stables. But Marjorie proved more composed, thanking the stable hands who took her mare, complimenting the architecture, though it clearly bore the scars of siege. She seemed adept at putting others at ease. Inside, Robb greeted them in the throne room for a brief ceremony of welcome. Marjorie's calm gaze flicked to the Iron Throne, betraying neither awe nor fear, only a measured interest. He introduced her to Catelyn and Sansa, who both greeted her politely. If Sansa felt any pang recalling that Marjorie had once been meant to wed Joffrey, she hid it well, instead offering the courtesies of a sister to the king. That evening, a feast was held. Though the realm was recovering, there was enough to provide a display of southern splendor. Roasted fowl with lemon sauce, fresh bread from the Tyrell wagons, succulent fish from the Blackwater. Musicians played lutes and flutes, their melodies weaving a lively tapestry. Marjorie sat at Robb's left, Mace Tyrell at his right. Catelyn and Sansa flanked them, while Tyrion Lannister was placed farther down the table, carefully watched by those who distrusted him. The conversation was a dance of politeness. Mace Tyrell boasted of Highgarden's abundance, while Marjorie deflected with modesty, praising the North's valor. Robb, still uneasy in the role of gracious royal host, managed to navigate with courtesy. He found Marjorie clever, though not as outwardly sharp-tongued as Olenna was reputed to be. Now and then, his gaze drifted across the hall to see how the northern lords were taking all this. Most seemed at least resigned, some looked suspicious, others merely curious. Eventually, he rose and offered a short toast. "To the end of war, and the hope of unity for our realm. May we walk a path that spares future generations from such bloodshed." They all drank, the guests calling out, "Hear, hear," and "Long live the king." Then the feast continued, though Robb spent most of it fielding polite questions from Marjorie. She asked about the North's customs, about Winterfell's architecture, about the old gods. She seemed genuinely interested, or at least skilled at feigning it. Her eyes flickered with something like empathy when he spoke of the toll war had taken. She did not mention Joffrey or Renly, and Robb did not pry. He knew her history was complicated enough. Later, after the feast ended and the guests filtered out, Robb found himself in a quiet corridor, walking Marjorie to the suite prepared for her. Two of her handmaidens trailed at a discreet distance, and gray wind padded behind them, drawing wary looks. Marjorie cast the direwolf a curious smile. "He's quite magnificent," she said softly, glancing at Grey Wind's pow. Her full form. "I've never seen one up close." Robb nodded. "He's my companion, a direwolf. My siblings and I found them as pups in the north. They're not mere dogs. They have a bond with us." She dipped her head, undaunted. "I believe it. There's an intelligence in his eyes." She hesitated, then drew a breath. "I know we're strangers, Your Grace, but I want you to know that I come here with sincere intentions. The war has cost us all dearly, and if there's a chance for peace, I want to be part of it." He studied her face in the torchlight. "I believe you want peace. Whether the rest of your family agrees is another matter." A flicker of a smile. "My grandmother might test your wits if she comes, but if you hold your own with her, I'll take it as a sign you can handle me as well." He almost smiled back, a strange relief that she could speak so candidly. "I'll do my best. Good night, my lady." She entered her chambers, the door shutting behind her, and Robb stood there for a moment, letting out a slow breath. Outside, the city lights twinkled, and an uneasy calm settled over the capital. The stage was set for a royal betrothal, and in the shadows of King's Landing, one could almost feel the swirl of new intrigues. The next day dawned with a biting wind that swept in from the sea, unseasonably cool. Robb met with Mace Tyrell and a small group of advisors to discuss the formal terms of the match. They convened in a smaller hall, away from the pomp of the throne room. Here, the negotiations took on a sharper tone. Mace demanded that the Tyrells be recognized as Wardens of the South, that they gain seats on the small council, that Highgarden's shipments of grain be given favorable tariffs. Robb sat with Brynden Tully, Great Jon Umber, and Tyrion Lannister at his side, all of them engaging in a slow, delicate dance of proposals and counterproposals. Wardens of the South is a title traditionally belonging to House Tyrell under Baratheon kings, Mace insisted, red-faced. And the orchard and farmland expansions, Brynden Tully cut in with a measured tone. Yet you would also expect a marriage portion of significant gold. Is that not so? A portion the crown cannot easily afford until the realm's debts are settled. Tyrion chimed in, leaning forward with his small hands folded. Perhaps we can redirect that portion from the funds your wagons are bringing. A portion of that gold can be considered the bride's dowry, effectively balancing out the cost. That way, the crown's debt to the Iron Bank remains manageable. Mace sputtered slightly, but Marjorie, seated beside him, intervened gently. Father, let us be reasonable. We want the realm stable. The wedding portion can be flexible. The important thing is establishing trust between our houses. A hush. Robb inclined his head. I agree. Let's put aside the bride's dowry for the moment. On the matter of titles, you shall have Warden of the South, so long as the Tyrells remain loyal and support the realm. In return, you supply King's Landing with grain at a fair price, not inflated, to ensure the people do not starve. Mace nodded, mollified. Yes, of course. I can see the wisdom in that. The negotiations wore on, but gradually, a shape emerged. The Tyrells would gain official recognition of their high seat, Marjorie would wed Robb, and in turn, House Tyrell would support the crown financially and militarily. It was a marriage of convenience with the potential for genuine synergy, assuming no hidden daggers lay under the surface. By midday, the rough outlines were settled. They agreed to formalize everything at a later date, perhaps a month hence, if the realm's security allowed. In the lull that followed, Marjorie asked Robb if she might walk in the castle gardens. He agreed, so they strolled through the green space behind the Red Keep, though gardens was a generous term for the patch of stunted hedges and dusty paths. The heat and the battles had not been kind to King's Landing's flora. Still, a few late-blooming flowers clung to life. Marjorie crouched to examine a pale rose bud, brushing its petals with her fingertips. Highgarden's roses are much larger, she said with a trace of melancholy. I miss the smell of them in the morning. Robb watched her. We could send for some seeds, perhaps, replant the gardens here. She smiled wistfully. Perhaps. It would be good to bring some beauty back to the city. Then her gaze lifted to him, open and direct. I see the weariness in your eyes, Your Grace. This war hasn't been kind to you, has it? He sighed, his shoulders tensing. I was never meant to be king of the 7 kingdoms. I only wanted justice for my father's death, for the North's safety. Now I have the throne, and I'm tied up in these southern intrigues. I'll do my duty, but it weighs on me. She studied him, those brown eyes calm. Duty is something I understand well. When I was betrothed to Renly, it was to bolster an alliance for my house. When he died, I was briefly considered for Joffrey, a means to keep the Tyrell fortunes aligned with the crown. Now fate has brought me here. I'll do my duty too, and I'll do it gladly if it means the people don't suffer another war. A small hush fell. Robb found himself feeling a kernel of gratitude for her frankness. If we are to wed, perhaps we can build something that isn't only political. I won't pretend I'm not torn by old vows, but I know what the realm needs. Marjorie's voice turned gentle. I won't ask for your heart outright, Your Grace, but if we can at least be partners, that might suffice. He gave a slow nod, unable to muster words for the tangle of emotions inside him. The distant cry of gulls broke the silence, and Marjorie rose, letting the pale rose slip from her fingers. They walked back toward the keep, the unspoken weight of the future hanging between them. Time passed quickly after that. Between gatherings, Robb oversaw further pacification of the Crownlands. News trickled in that Edmure Tully and Roose Bolton's men had broken the Lannister loyalist band in the Riverlands, capturing or killing many outlaws. Brynden Tully took the field as well, showing the skill that earned him his fierce reputation. The infiltration was not entirely ended, but for once, the main roads seemed safer. Flea Bottom still seethed with petty crime, yet the City Watch was slowly reconstituted under men loyal to the new crown. Tyrion's input regarding how to manage the Watch had proven invaluable. All the while, Marjorie Tyrell became a fixture at court. She organized small charitable ventures, distributing bread and blankets to orphans near the ruins of the Dragon Pit. She charmed many of the Northern Knights by learning their names, praising their discipline. She spent evenings conversing with Sansa, who began warming to her, two young women with shared scars from the cruelty of a southern court. Even the skeptical Greatjon was seen laughing at one of Marjorie's jokes about southern wine. Some called her the Little Queen, a term used behind fans and folded hands. In truth, she was already weaving a web of good favor, intentionally or not. Robb remained cautious but found it more and more difficult to view her as an enemy. She seemed genuine in her desire to build trust. One night, she arranged for a minstrel from the Reach to sing ballads of the North's heroes, songs of Brandon the Builder, tales of ancient Stark kings. Robb listened, intrigued by her willingness to honor his heritage. Afterward, she stood near him on a balcony, the moonlight tracing the contours of her face. "I hope it was not presumptuous," she said softly, "to celebrate your northern legends. I only wanted to show respect." He shook his head. "You keep surprising me." She lowered her gaze. "If we are to stand together, I'd like to see the North integrated into the realm in a way that honors your traditions. The faith of the Seven is strong in the South, but I know you hold to the old gods. Perhaps there's a way to hold both truths without conflict." Robb thought of the direwolves carved into the walls of Winterfell's crypts, the weirwood trees standing silent vigil. "It won't be easy. The realm can be unkind to differences." She lifted her chin slightly. "Then let us make it kinder." They stood for a moment longer, the hush of the night wrapping around them. Robb felt a fleeting sense of comfort, though the memory of the war's brutality never vanished. Before he could speak again, a messenger arrived out of breath to inform them that a ship had docked in the Blackwater, bearing an envoy from Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon was making overtures for a parley. The next morning, the envoy stood in the Great Hall. A tall, gaunt man with a pinched face, he wore the fiery heart sigil of Stannis. Around him, the northern guards arranged in a half-circle, hands near their weapons. Robb ascended the dais steps, pausing just short of the Iron Throne, flanked by Catelyn, Brynden, and a few others. Grey wind lurked near the base of the dais, eyes locked on the stranger. "Speak," Robb said, voice carrying across the open space. The envoy bowed stiffly. "Your Grace, I come on behalf of King Stannis Baratheon, rightful heir to King Robert. He wishes to avoid further bloodshed between your forces and his. He proposes that you cede King's Landing to him. By law, it is his seat as Robert's true brother, and in exchange, he will name you Warden of the North, confirm your holdings, and ensure that your father's murder is avenged." Marjorie, standing quietly near Catelyn, looked on with composed calm, though a flicker of annoyance crossed her face at the phrase King Stannis. Tyrion, farther back, rolled his eyes, though he said nothing for the moment. The hall tensed, waiting for Robb's reply. Robb felt a flicker of anger. "I have already avenged my father's murder. Joffrey Baratheon has paid for that crime. As for King's Landing, I hold it by right of conquest. Does your master truly believe I would simply hand it over?" The envoy's lips thinned. "Stannis is the rightful king by the line of succession. He believes that if you recognize his claim, you need not fear him. He might even reward you with autonomy in the north." A hush. Robb considered the implications. Stannis had never been one to compromise, Yet here he was, offering terms that left Robb in control of the north. But the price was giving up the crown and the city. He glanced at Marjorie, seeing her stare at the envoy with polite disbelief, then at Catelyn, whose face was grim. Roose Bolton stood at the far edges of the hall, eyes shadowed, giving no sign of his thoughts. Finally, Robb's voice broke the stillness. "Tell Stannis Baratheon that I respect his resolve. But the city is under my protection. If he has a rightful claim, let him present it to a great council of the realm. We can debate who is rightful. But until such a council is convened, and I doubt the lords would accept it, he has no authority here." The envoy's mouth tightened. "Then you refuse? My king will not be pleased." Robb's eyes hardened. "I am the king these people have accepted. If Stannis seeks to press his claim by force, he's welcome to try, though we have ample men and allies. But I offer this. Let him hold Dragonstone, let him rule the Stormlands if he can gain their support, and we can forge a peace between us. There is room for more than one region under a single banner, so long as we do not unsheath swords." A tremor of disapproval ran through the envoy's features. Stannis was not known for such half measures. "I will deliver your words, your grace." "Do so," Robb said, "and do not threaten my city again." With that, the envoy was led from the hall. A rumble of conversation broke out among the assembled lords, some muttering that Stannis would never relent, others speculating he might muster a navy to assault them. Tyrion gave Robb a tight nod, as if approving of the stance. Marjorie exhaled quietly, stepping closer. "That was well done," she murmured. "You did not insult him outright, but you gave no ground." Robb grimaced. "He'll likely see it as a rejection. I expect we'll face him eventually." She placed a light hand on his arm. "Then we'll be ready." The days rolled on, and the city breathed easier as more Tyrell grain arrived. The small folk began whispering that the new king was no usurper but a protector who cared for their bellies. Meanwhile, the martial law Robb imposed slowly relaxed into structured governance, with city officials, vetted by Tyrion and a few loyal northern knights, organizing the distribution of supplies. Nightly, torches glimmered along the walls as watchmen patrolled, watchful for any sign of sabotage. One starlit evening, in a courtyard behind the Red Keep, Robb stood alone, practicing sword forms by lamplight. The ring of steel echoed off stone walls, each strike aimed at imaginary foes. He had once spent hours in Winterfell's courtyard, training under his father's guidance, or sparring with Jon Snow before Jon left for the Wall. Here, the weight of his sword felt both familiar and alien, as if reminding him that he was a soldier at heart, forced into a king's role. His muscles burned, sweat trickled down his brow. At last he lowered the blade, breathing hard. The faint odor of lemon trees wafted by, carried on a salty breeze from the sea. Footsteps sounded on the flagstones. He turned to see Marjorie approach, a light cloak over her shoulders, her expression cautious. "Forgive me," she said softly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." He wiped his brow with the back of his forearm, feeling a bit self-conscious. "It's all right. I was only practicing." She nodded, watching him. "You move with purpose, but also with anger." He tensed, gripping the sword's hilt. "Maybe I'm angry at everything that's happened. My father's death, the war, the responsibility I never wanted." She stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Anger is understandable, Robb. I'm sorry for what you've lost. If there's any comfort, your father is avenged. You ended the reign of those who killed him." He let out a slow breath. "I know, but now thousands look to me for guidance. I fear making the wrong choice. My father always seemed so sure, yet in the end, it cost him his life." She touched his arm lightly, just above the elbow. "Your father's honor wasn't misplaced. He inspired loyalty in good men. You carry that same spirit, but perhaps tempered by caution. You're not alone. Your mother, your uncles, your bannermen, your sister, even I, if we become one." He gazed at her, candlelight catching in her hair. "You speak as if you believe in me." Her smile was small but earnest. "I do. I see how you treat the small folk, how you wrestle with moral choices. That is more than some kings manage." She paused, then added, "I know this alliance began as politics, but I'd like to think it could be more. I'd like to help you bear this weight." A hush fell over them. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, the sword heavy in his grip. Without quite knowing why, he leaned in and kissed her lightly on the forehead, an impulsive gesture of gratitude. She looked surprised but not displeased, and in that moment, the tension in the courtyard softened. The only witnesses were the shadows of the keep and the distant shimmer of the sea. They parted awkwardly, stepping back as a guard called from the corridor, announcing that Lord Bolton requested the king's immediate presence in the war room. Marjorie smiled ruefully, as if to say, "Such is the nature of this life." He sheathed his sword, nodding to her, and then hurried off to see what trouble awaited. He found Roose Bolton and a pair of northern captains stooped over a map of the Blackwater Bay. Bolton looked up, his pale face expressionless. "Your Grace, we've just received reports that Stannis' fleet is active along the coast. They're not attacking, but they've sent scouts near Duskendale." Robb leaned over the table, scanning the coastline. "Duskendale? That's too close for comfort." Bolton nodded. "Indeed, if Stannis lands an army there, he could march south and threaten King's Landing from the north. Our best recourse is to fortify that region or prepare a navy to intercept." Robb rubbed his temples. "Our navy is limited. The Lannisters lost much of theirs at the Blackwater, and we haven't had time to rebuild. The Tyrell ships might help, though I doubt Mace Tyrell would commit them without negotiation." Bolton's thin lips curved slightly. "We should at least send an emissary to Duskendale, urging them to remain loyal. If they waver, Stannis could walk in." Robb agreed, dispatching a raven that very night. The tension of a new conflict loomed, but there was no immediate blow. Stannis might have been testing their defenses. A standstill followed, a cold war of sorts, neither side ready to commit to open battle. Amid these uncertainties, the date for Robb's official betrothal announcement approached. Musicians practiced in the Red Keep's halls, preparing for a grand ball. Seamstresses fussed over Marjorie's gown, a flowing piece of green satin embroidered with gold roses. The northern lords teased Robb good-naturedly about wedding a southern beauty, though some still harbored reservations. Sansa helped Marjorie select adornments, forging a delicate friendship shaped by shared experiences of courtly life. Finally, the day arrived. A crowd gathered in the throne room, hushes of excitement rippling through the onlookers. Catelyn Stark stood near the dais, face brimming with pride and caution. Tyrion Lannister hovered at the periphery, observing. Roose Bolton watched with an inscrutable gaze, while Brynden Tully made a show of support by wearing both the direwolf and the trout on a double pin. Robb entered from one side, wearing his crown and a cloak of gray trimmed with silver fur, the direwolf sigil embroidered upon it. Marjorie entered from the other, in her resplendent gown, the light catching on subtle gold threads that shimmered like morning dew. The hush deepened as they met before the throne's dais, a septon standing between them with a small book, symbolizing the faith's recognition of betrothals. The septon cleared his throat. "We gather to witness the pledge between His Grace, Robb of House Stark, King of the Undulls and the Royner and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm, and Lady Marjorie of House Tyrell, daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell of Highgarden. May the Seven smile upon this union, or, for the king's sake, may the old gods bless it as well." A ripple of subdued laughter followed that last remark. Robb clasped Marjorie's hands, feeling the coolness of her slender fingers. His heart thudded in his chest, a mixture of nerves and strange anticipation. This alliance was a cornerstone of his reign, yet it was also a personal step he never imagined taking under such circumstances. "I, Robb of House Stark," he began, voice resonating, "do hereby pledge to take Marjorie Tyrell in betrothal, to unite our houses, to honor her with all the duties of a husband and king, and to protect her as my queen-to-be in the sight of gods old and new." She met his gaze with a gentle smile. "I, Marjorie of House Tyrell, do pledge to join with Robb Stark, king of these realms, to stand by him as queen, to support him in peace and in war, to serve the realm's good above all else, and to honor his name. The Septon raised his hands. Let all present bear witness. These two are betrothed. May their union herald a new era of prosperity for the realm. A restrained applause rippled through the hall, not the thunderous ovation of a populace wild with joy, but an earnest acceptance. So, knights clashed hilts against breastplates in salute. The Tyrell followers cheered with more exuberance, tossing a few petals from hidden satchels. The northern men seemed more subdued, though some wore respectful smiles. Catelyn's eyes misted, no doubt recalling her own betrothal to Ned. Sansa clapped politely, a sad, thoughtful expression on her face. Robb leaned in, kissing Marjorie's cheek, the gesture sealing the vow. She flushed slightly, though she maintained her composure with queenly grace. The crowd parted to let them pass, and a small reception followed. Wine was poured, sweetmeats were offered. Tyrion approached with a wry grin. "Congratulations. May the two of you outlive these turbulent times." Marjorie dipped her head. "You speak as one who knows the fragility of wedding vows, Lord Tyrion." He chuckled mirthlessly. "I was once forcibly wed to a bride who did not want me. May your fates prove kinder." Meanwhile, Mace Tyrell bustled around, offering toasts, beaming like a man who believed the realm was now firmly under Tyrell influence. Robb accepted his congratulations with carefully measured politeness, aware that a single misstep could sour this alliance. In the midst of the social swirl, Marjorie locked eyes with Robb, and in that glance he felt an unspoken promise. They would try to shape something worthwhile out of this union, for themselves and for the realm. When the celebrations ended, Robb retreated to the relative quiet of his solar, accompanied by Marjorie, Catelyn, and Brynden Tully for a final discussion of the wedding date. They agreed to hold the ceremony in 2 months, enough time to prepare the city and invite the major lords who might wish to attend. Marjorie's grandmother Olenna might come as well, though she remained at Highgarden for the time being. Robb felt a mixture of trepidation and relief that it was not happening immediately. As Marjorie departed with Catelyn, Brynden lingered. The Blackfish eyed Robb with a frankness that cut through courtly pretenses. "I'm happy for you, lad," he said softly. "Yet I see the burden behind your eyes. Don't let it crush you. Marriage can be a boon if you find understanding in one another." Robb nodded. "I appreciate your counsel, uncle. Do you think father would approve?" Brynden placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. Ned Stark wanted peace. He'd do whatever was necessary to protect his people. "I think he'd approve if it ends the bloodshed." That was enough to ease the tightness in Robb's chest, at least for the moment. They parted ways and Robb walked the dark corridors alone, gray wind trotting behind him. Outside, the wind moaned over the battlements, and the moon cast pale light on the city that sprawled below. So many souls looked to him now, a boy from Winterfell who had taken King's Landing by storm. Could he truly unify a realm that had seen so much war, betrayal, and tragedy? The day of the wedding inched closer, each sunrise bringing new challenges. Rumors of Stannis' movements continued. Dorne sent a polite but non-committal letter, noting they watched developments carefully. The Vale, under Lisa Arryn's reclusive rule, remained aloof, though some knights of the Vale wrote to express potential interest in treaties. The Iron Islands were torn by the death of Balon Greyjoy and the ascent of Euron, the Crow's Eye, whose intentions were as murky as deep waters. Meanwhile, the scars of war festered in the Riverlands, even as Edmure and his men tried to restore order. Robb held the city through daily decisions, meeting with traders, reorganizing the City Watch, revising tax codes to something less ruinous than the Lannisters' demands, yet still enough to keep the realm afloat. He appointed a handful of new council members, some loyal Northerners, some from the Crownlands who had proven their worth. Tyrion remained a constant presence, providing sharp, if occasionally cynical, insight. Marjorie quietly assisted wherever she could, visiting orphans, distributing alms, and making subtle suggestions that bridged differences between North and South. Slowly, King's Landing began to recover its vibrancy, though it remained a bruised and uncertain place. Throughout it all, Robb never forgot those still missing from his family. Bran and Rickon remained in the north, presumably safe but distant. Arya's whereabouts were unknown. Sometimes he felt her presence like a phantom at his side, remembering how she once insisted on learning swordplay. The old gods alone knew if she was alive or if the war had swallowed her. At times, he found Sansa alone in a garden or a corridor, gazing at nothing with haunted eyes. He tried to comfort her, but words failed. The siblings had both grown older than their years, shaped by loss that no child should endure. The city soon buzzed with talk of the impending royal wedding. Marjorie's seamstresses stitched day and night, preparing a gown that would rival any in memory. Northern lords trickled in from the road, exchanging startled glances at the southern opulence. Musicians practiced new compositions that honored both the old gods and the new. Catelyn wrote invitations to various lords, including Doran Martell of Dorne, though no one truly expected him to attend. Just having the invite sent was a gesture of inclusivity. One crisp morning, Robb walked along the castle battlements, Marjorie by his side. They wore fur-lined cloaks against the chill. A hush lay over the city beneath them, the rooftops glimmering with dew. She glanced at him sidelong. "It's almost here," she said. "The wedding. Does it make you anxious?" He breathed in, letting the cold air ground him. "A little. So many will be watching, wanting something, favors, alliances, deals. I'm also anxious that something might go wrong. My family's track record with weddings." He trailed off, recalling the red wedding that nearly happened in another thread of fate. Marjorie nodded sympathetically. "I've been at weddings that ended poorly myself, but we must have faith that this time it will be different. The realm needs joy, if only for a night." He turned to her. "And after the wedding, will you remain at my side here, or do you wish to see Highgarden again soon?" A smile curved her lips. "I'll remain, of course, as your queen. Highgarden will survive without me for a while. My father and grandmother can handle matters there." She paused, then added softly, "I hope we can make a life here that isn't just politics. Perhaps, in time, we'll journey north to see Winterfell, to pay homage to your forebears." A warmth kindled in his chest. "I'd like that," he admitted. "Winterfell was everything to me. It's far from the opulence of the south, but it has a strength of its own." They stood there, the wind tugging at her hair and ruffling his cloak, forging a moment of calm amid the ongoing storm. Far below, a few people traversed the streets. A farmer hauling a cart, a pair of guards on patrol, a small cluster of children chasing each other with laughter that drifted faintly upward. The realm was scarred but still alive, still beating with the pulse of life that refused to surrender to war. He prayed that this wedding might signal a turning of the tide, a step toward lasting peace, or at least a reprieve from endless strife. In the next fortnight, the final touches came together. The Great September of Baelor, once the site of Ned Stark's terrible end, was prepared for a wedding ceremony that would blend the traditions of the Seven with a solemn nod to the old gods. Robb wasn't entirely comfortable with kneeling before the Seven, but he allowed the High Septon to perform his part, while he and Marjorie also planned a small private ceremony near a weirwood sapling that had been transplanted to the Red Keep's godswood. A compromise, bridging two faiths in a single union, symbolic of the kingdom they hoped to unite. Guards scoured the city for any sign of sabotage, rounding up known criminals. Tyrion orchestrated security within the Red Keep, mindful of how previous royal weddings had ended in tragedy. Lord Bolton commanded patrols outside the walls, ensuring no rebellious factions tried to disrupt the festivities. Edmure Tully returned from the Riverlands to attend, leaving a trusted castellan to oversee his lands. Even Kevan Lannister sent a polite note of congratulations from Casterly Rock, though he did not attend in person. Finally, the wedding day dawned bright, the sky a startling blue without a cloud in sight. Banners flapped in the breeze, one side bearing the direwolf sigil of House Stark, the other showing the golden rose of House Tyrell. The great September spells pealed, a deep, resonant toll that echoed through the winding streets. Crowds gathered along the route, hoping for a glimpse of the royal couple as they made their way to the sept in a modest procession. Robb rode a dark stallion, wearing polished armor under a cloak of gray fur, the northern crown atop his head. Beside him, Marjorie sat in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, the sides draped in green and gold brocade. Catelyn and Sansa followed in another carriage. Knights in shining plate trotted behind them, and foot soldiers marched ahead, clearing the path. The crowds gasped and cheered, throwing handfuls of petals, some chanting, "Long live the king!" Others cried, "Blessings to the Tyrell Rose." The city, battered by war, seized on any excuse to celebrate. They entered the Great September, a cavernous space lit by hundreds of candles. The floor gleamed with polished marble, and the statues of the Seven looked down with cold, stony faces. The High Septon waited at the altar, clad in robes embroidered with gold thread. Noble guests packed the pews: northern lords, Tyrell courtiers, representatives from other regions. The hush was immense as Robb escorted Marjorie down the aisle, gray wind left behind at the keep to avoid startling the devout. Catelyn blinked back tears when they reached the altar. Sansa stood beside her, hands clasped. Mace Tyrell, standing near his daughter, looked fit to burst with pride. Marjorie's gown trailed behind her, a shimmering wave of green and gold, and she wore a circlet of silver roses that caught the candlelight. Robb felt his throat constrict with nerves. The High Septon began the rites, invoking the father, the mother, the warrior, and so on, speaking of unity and the forging of houses. When it came time for the vows, the hush in the sept was absolute. Robb spoke first, voice echoing, "I, Robb of House Stark, King of the Undulls and the Royner and the First Men, pledge myself to you, Marjorie of House Tyrell, to cherish and protect, to unite our houses in the cause of peace, and to honor you as my queen and wife." Marjorie's reply was clear and melodious. "I, Marjorie of House Tyrell, pledge myself to you, Robb Stark, to stand by you as queen and consort, to uphold the realm and serve its people, and to share in both your burdens and joys." The High Septon anointed their brows with scented oil, then declared them husband and wife before the Seven. A smattering of applause rose, subdued by the solemn atmosphere of the September. Robb leaned in, placing a gentle kiss on Marjorie's lips, sealing the vow. She returned it demurely, a faint warmth in her cheeks. In that moment, the watchers burst into fuller cheers, some calling blessings, others weeping with relief that the realm might now see better days. Outside, a wave of celebration greeted them as they emerged from the September. The bells pealed again, echoing across the city. They led a procession back to the Red Keep, where a grand feast awaited. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, capons, fresh fruit, and exotic spices from across the narrow sea. Musicians played lively tunes, jugglers and acrobats performed, and there was even talk of a small band of dwarfs, though Tyrion politely suggested that might be in poor taste given the fiasco during Joffrey's wedding. Robb and Marjorie took their seats at the high table. Catelyn, Sansa, Mace Tyrell, Brynden Tully, and a few other High Lords joined them. Toasts were given, wine flowed, and Robb endured an onslaught of jokes about bedding ceremonies and fathering heirs. Marjorie smiled through it all, poised and gracious. She cast Robb occasional glances that conveyed empathy for his discomfort, even as she played the role of queen effortlessly. At one point, Tyrion rose to offer a toast, standing on his chair so all could see him. His goblet winked in the torchlight. "Your Grace, my Lady Queen, I raise a toast to the union of the wolf and the rose. May your thorns guard our realm, and your claws protect our gardens." A ripple of laughter followed the whimsical imagery. He bowed, then drank deeply, concluding with a wry grin. The festivities stretched into the night, the hall filling with dancing and conversation. Through it all, Robb felt a curious mixture of apprehension and hope. No wedding was guaranteed safety in these lands, but the night passed without bloodshed or acrimony. The people ate, drank, and for a brief time forgot the horrors of war. Marjorie danced with Robb, the swirl of her gown catching the firelight, her eyes shining with something akin to triumph. Whether purely personal or political, one could not say. Yet at least it was not the smirk of cruelty that Joffrey once wore. It was a smile that promised partnership. Near midnight, a final dance ended, and servants escorted guests to their quarters or out into the city. Robb and Marjorie were led to the royal chambers, accompanied by the suggestive hoots of a few drunken knights. Robb shot them an admonishing look, but some traditions of wedding nights died hard. Marjorie bore it with a soft laugh, letting handmaidens usher her inside. Eventually, the doors shut, leaving the two alone. A hush lingered in the dimly lit chamber. Candles flickered, and the faint scent of lavender rose from fresh linens. Marjorie removed her circlet, setting it aside, then glanced at Robb. She seemed calm, though a hint of nerves showed in her posture. He bowed his head slightly. "I suppose this is where we begin our life as husband and wife." She stepped closer, lifting her arms to slip them around his shoulders. "We've both carried our burdens, Robb. Maybe tonight we can set them down for a while." He met her gaze, remembering their shared vow to do more than just reign, to find a shred of solace in each other's company. Slowly, he leaned in and kissed her softly at first. She returned it, and in that moment all the tension of the day melted away. For one night, at least, they would attempt to find peace in each other's arms. Outside, the wind rustled the banners above the keep, carrying the faint echoes of revelry from the feast hall. The city slept under the watchful eyes of patrolling guards. The realm was far from healed. Stannis still lurked, the Iron Islands bristled, Dorne watched from afar, and the memory of war still haunted every shadow. Yet for this one night, King Robb Stark and Queen Marjorie Tyrell forged a private bond that might, with luck and determination, help them guide the Seven Kingdoms through the storms yet to come. Come morning, the first day of their shared reign began in earnest. They woke to the pale dawn light filtering through heavy drapes, the city stirring beyond stone walls. Robb rose quietly, letting Marjorie slumber a bit longer. He dressed in simple clothes, not wanting to don the crown so soon, and stepped onto the balcony. From here, the sprawl of King's Landing spread out, dotted with rooftops and the distant shimmer of the Blackwater. He felt the breeze brush his hair, reminding him of the cold winds of the north. In that tranquil moment, he allowed himself a fragile hope, that he and Marjorie might shepherd the realm toward unity, that the memory of Ned Stark would guide him, that he could be both a just ruler and a compassionate man. The direwolf and the rose, entwined on the banners that snapped in the wind, told the story of unlikely alliances. If they could nurture it into something genuine, perhaps the realm would have a chance. Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of blankets as Marjorie stirred. Her voice, still drowsy, called his name. He looked back, offering a faint smile. Their story was only just beginning, and though the path ahead remained fraught with potential dangers, he would face each challenge with the same resolve that had carried him this far. Robb Stark, once a boy from Winterfell, now a king in King's Landing with a queen at his side, guided by the memory of an honorable father and the unwavering loyalty of his northern kin. A new era dawned, uncertain but alive with possibility. If the gods were good, it might yield a realm at peace, governed by the kind of justice that Ned Stark would have been proud to see. And if the gods were cruel, then they would face that cruelty together, determined not to bend under its weight. For now, that was enough. He left the balcony, returning to the bedchamber as the new day stretched out before them. The Wolf King and the Rose Queen had a kingdom to tend, a tapestry of alliances to weave, and a chance, slim though it might be, to reshape Westeros into a place worthy of the hopes and sacrifices of those who had come before. The journey ahead would be long, but at least they would not walk it alone.